Good morning, everyone. My name is Scott Appleby. I am the Dean of the Donald R. Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, and I am delighted to be co-hosting this event, the Global Fragility Forum, with our co-sponsors, Alliance for Peace Building, Mercy Corps, and Search for Common Ground. I want to take just a second to thank and acknowledge those three organizations whose leadership and professional staff work tirelessly around the world to stabilize regions that are vulnerable and to prevent conflict. We're delighted to be co-hosting with them. We are honored today to have as our headliners Senator Chris Coons of Delaware and Senator Todd Young of that great state of Indiana. Senator Coons has a son at Notre Dame. Senator Young has lectured to our students and interacted with them at Notre Dame. And these two senators are the leaders nationally in this very important area of conflict prevention and stabilization. So we are grateful for their joint leadership in this area and delighted that they're with us today to set the tone of and the content of our morning. Along with us are also Assistant Secretary Denise Natalia from the State Department and Admiral Tim Ziemer from USAID. We're delighted they're both with us. There are many prominent speakers throughout the morning, and their full bios are in your program. So please get the details there. I want to say just a word about the question that I'm sure you're all asking. Why the Keough School of Global Affairs? Why are we hosting this event? The first new school at Notre Dame in nearly a century. And as a Catholic university, we're required to think in terms of threes. So there are three reasons we're hosting this. First, as Notre Dame's first new school in nearly a century, we are composed of 9 international institutes that now come together, working together under the same roof. And these institutes, as I'll mention in a moment, address different aspects of challenges to stability around the world. One of those institutes, among the many that focus on research and scholarship and policy work at Notre Dame, is the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. The Kroc Institute is, I think I can say without fear of contradiction, we all like to brag about ourselves, but the Kroc Institute is one of the leading centers in the world for understanding conflict prevention, conflict transformation, strategic peace building. I think we have one of the distinguished graduates of the Institute. I haven't seen him yet. Is Peter Caranto here? Where are you, Peter? That's great. Stand up. Thanks, Peter. Peter is known to many of you in this room as the Senior Advisor for Peace and Security in the Office of U.S. Foreign Assistance Resources in the State Department. And Peter has done great work over the years in conflict prevention and stabilization. And most important for us, he's a terrific individual. And we're so proud that you're one of our grads, Peter, in the Kroc Institute, and we're delighted you're here. Thanks for being with us. Second reason that the Keough School is engaged in this work here in our new offices in DC is that we are engaged in addressing some of the most challenging problems facing the world. In a way, the term global fragility can cover a great deal of it. But we are concerned with threats to human flourishing from poverty, conflict, all of the pernicious effects of climate change. And we are training graduates to work in government, in non-governmental organizations, in the private sector, to be ethical and effective professional leaders in these areas. And so it is particularly appropriate that we are here today to address this important topic. Indeed, we have some of our students here. We just opened the Keough School. We're entering our third academic year this fall. So we had our first graduating class in the 2-year cohort of the master's students. And we have several of those graduates here. I'm going to ask them to stand along with some of the students who are entering their second year. Would you folks stand up in the back there? You're toward the back. All right. there's the future, ladies and gentlemen. So we're very proud of these folks who have gone through the ringer. This first class, we call them at times guinea pigs, at other times pioneers. One day they'll really be thought of as pioneers. Thank you. You may be seated. Third, and related to the other points I've made about the Keough School, is our mission in the Keough School is to advance integral human development. This is a concept taken out of Catholic social teaching, but it's resonant in other religious traditions, ethical and wisdom traditions. And the idea is that as we address these challenges of global conflict and health concerns and stability, we focus on the dignity of the individual human person. And we understand that person as not just an isolated individual, but as a member of a family, a faith tradition, a culture, a society. And so we have to take very seriously the cultures and the societies in which these folks live that we work with. That's a challenge because we also have to teach our students quantitative and qualitative skills of leadership, but we can't ignore the whole of the person and understanding every aspect we can so that human flourishing is addresses the entire person and the embedded community. So in a sense, it's a holistic approach. That's why it is, again, particularly appropriate that today we're discussing a topic that requires a holistic approach. First of all, whole of government, it has to be bipartisan. It has to engage the private sector, government, NGOs, because the world is increasingly, as we all know, threatened by instability, by conflict, by migration due to climate change and wars and government corruption. These are just enormous problems, and we are delighted to be one small part of a much bigger conversation here. And that's why I am, again, particularly pleased and honored and delighted that we will start the day's conversation with Senator Coons and Senator Young, who I asked to come to the stage now, along with Mara Policelli, the Executive Director of the Keough School's Washington, D.C. office. Please welcome our distinguished guests.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dean Appleby. Thank you, Maura, and go Irish. That's the only way to begin any event. I am so grateful for the ways in which Notre Dame and the Keough School are leading conversations around peace building and conflict resolution. We are blessed to have a range of organizations from Search for Common Ground to the U.S. Institute for Peace, obviously the Assistant Secretary, the Admiral, representing State Department and AID. This is a great gathering to have this conversation. First, some of you may have heard that in the Congress we're having trouble getting along. Anybody heard that? Anybody? The first accomplishment of this bill is that we have 19 co-sponsors, Republicans and Democrats. In the Senate, it has already passed the Foreign Relations Committee overwhelmingly. It has already passed the House of Representatives, and the lead co-sponsors, Chairman Engel and Ranking Member McCall, also represent that sort of broad bipartisanship. So first, this is a strategy that engages the executive branch, which has supported it, the legislative branch, which is trying to enact it, but it is rooted in thorough study. So the United States Institute of Peace led a nearly 2-year-long blue ribbon panel process to say, since 9/11, we've spent nearly $6 trillion in combating violent extremism around the world as a country. And how are we doing? What are the results? Today, there are more people displaced. There are more instances of terrorism and violence, and there is less stability in the world. So this is just a rough summary. A military-led, Department of Defense-led counterterrorism, counter-violence strategy, largely disconnected from our diplomacy and development strategies, are not successful so far. We are frankly playing whack-a-mole, and there are more moles than we can whack. And we frankly need to take a step back and look at the processes that lead to instability and lead to fragility. And that's what the Blue Ribbon Panel USIP led, and many of you contributed to, concluded, which is it is possible to have a sustainable, rational strategy to proactively invest in preventing fragile states from becoming failed states. If you look at the human costs and the security costs of just 2 countries, Syria and Libya, and their near collapse as states and the way in which they have metastasized violence and instability and human suffering across whole regions. And if we look across Central America and the Sahel and Africa, there's at least any of us could name a dozen countries that are right at that cusp of being the next Libya, the next Somalia, where thoughtful, rational, measured investment with metrics and accountability, and with a rational strategy that combines the 3 Ds of diplomacy, development, and defense, could have a successful outcome.
So, Senator Young, how would the Global Fragility Act, if it does make it through the Senate, if both of you deliver, no pressure.
He will. Me, I'm not so sure.
If Senator Young, no, we won't put pressure on either one of you in particular. If it does become law, how will it make things different than they currently have been with the 3 Ds, those 3 agencies, if you will, of government trying to tackle this? It's not a new problem. It's, from what I understand, not a new concept of let's coordinate and work together and prevent the next Libya. But how will the legislation push that forward in a way that it has not been able to in this town to date?
So thank you for the question, and Maura, thank you for having me here. I appreciate the invitation, Dean, and very, very proud to have the University of Notre Dame located in the great state of Indiana. And I'm proud of this school as well. Your students are incredibly sharp. They ask probing questions, and the scholarship that you deliver has been helpful to me, and look forward to our continued work in the future. The way we affect change in this sort of whole of government fashion is similar to other pieces of legislation that we've seen out there in the past. And there haven't been many, but we've seen some in the public health realm. We've seen in the social sphere, in other areas of governance. And effectively, when the legislative branch statutorily directs different agencies of government to work together in an interdisciplinary fashion with deliverables required at particular points in time by statutes, we end up with a lot better results. We sort of, as the old saying goes, we tear down the walls and connect the dots between oftentimes very talented individuals that populate these buildings around here, but their portfolio is oftentimes quite narrow. And if we can get them to collaborate cross-functionally, in this instance to address global fragility, then we end up with better results. We are advocating this piece of legislation and receiving bipartisan support and a whole lot of support from stakeholders like those in this room and people who may be watching this event here today, because the world has changed. The United Nations tells us that we've seen a spike since 1995 when I graduated the U.S. Naval Academy. And it seemed like the only hot zone we had going on at the time was Bosnia. And that, of course, had second and third order effects. There's still lingering effects from that conflict. But we now have somewhere in north, the UN tells us, of 400 violent conflicts worldwide. And I think there is both a recognition and a demand at a time of scarce resources that we focus, as Chris was saying, on prevention as opposed to a militarized, reactive solution. I like this legislation. Yes, Chris, what the hallmarks are of this legislation that he was most proud of. For me, there are a few different features of it. First, it's genuinely designed to be whole of government, as I've already mentioned. Second, we measure effectiveness. I rarely sign on to major pieces of legislation that authorize significant amount of money, as this one does, without some sort of evaluative component. This requires certain metrics to be delivered to Congress. This requires a teased out strategy in advance. This requires frequent consultation with all major stakeholders, national and local government, civil society, Congress itself. And so It is genuinely designed to be an evidence-based piece of legislation. And the last reason I think it's important is, and I just can't say this enough, what I hear from our top military brass consistently is that we need to place more emphasis. We, of course, need to continue to invest in our military capabilities and invest smartly. But we need to place more emphasis on our diplomacy and development. The other two Ds on sort of three legs of the national security stool, and this legislation really emphasizes that.
So, two questions. You can both pick which one you'd like to tackle. Building off of the point that there are significant funds behind this legislation, $1.2 billion over 5 years. So how does that get explained to your constituents, who for the most part are probably not every day thinking about the 3Ds and some of these parts of the world? Many of them are very global time and globally aware Americans. But what would be your, answer as to why U.S. taxpayer dollars should be invested in this effort that is an internationally focused effort? And the second question is on the point of, again, how the coordination would work. The notion that aid and defense in particular could intersect in ways that wouldn't actually be counterproductive on the ground, so that aid is not seen as militarized by those who they're trying to help, and so that the national security apparatus and efforts of the U.S. government don't become diluted into being development focused when these are people trained to be implementing national security focused efforts. So how does it work? Either one of you tackle the money part and explaining that, or the actual connection between development and military efforts on the ground.
I'm happy to take a stab at it after spending 2 years in the United States Senate. As someone who's spent most of my lifetime being fairly concise and listening a lot, I have developed the ability to filibuster, but I won't. So
It's an ability that simply grows with time. Trust me.
I am looking for the elevator pitch.
yeah. So here's the elevator pitch.
The constituents won't listen for very long on this one.
Here's the elevator pitch. Number one, we cannot afford not to invest in prevention, whether it's in healthcare research or in addressing global fragility, because you end up paying so much more on the back end. So we need to be a lot more intelligent and responsible stewards of the public fisc during this time of limited resources, and I think a good thing, heightened scrutiny from the American people. Number two, I acknowledge the budgetary challenges. Right now, we're having a very difficult time coming to terms up on Capitol Hill, working with the White House on developing the continuing resolution, budget caps, and so forth. So we want to make sure that every dollar of taxpayer money that we spend is spent effectively. And if somewhere along the way we determine that it's not being spent effectively on this program, I think neither Chris nor I would feel comfortable continuing to spend money in the same way. So you'd either want to modify the program, which is where all of you can play a constructive role. You can critically assess our efficacy, which is part of the reason we have this evaluative component in the legislation. Or at some point, we can decide that this has been a valiant effort and we move on. A bit of legislative humility, I think, is required in this business. So that's really the argument with respect to militarization of our development efforts and our diplomatic efforts. That's a real challenge. There are distinct disciplines out there, something I've come to appreciate serving with Chris in the Foreign Relations Committee. But you have hard power, and I know there's overlap here, but you have hard power, you have development expertise and you have diplomatic expertise, and people are trained in, and they sort of marinate in each of the given professions. We ought not hand the entire portfolio over to the military because it happens to be politically popular to load more money onto the National Defense Authorization Act as opposed to channeling it into the appropriate agency. So here too, this legislation intelligently directs funds towards where it should be. Yeah.
Elevator
That was a
pitch.
long. That's a 485, I think. But
But he tackled both questions, so I should have timed you, but not bad. Not bad.
Elevator pitch. 3 weeks from now, 500 young men and women from Delaware of the 198th Signal Battalion deploy for the 4th time. The young men and women of the Delaware National Guard, and I'm certain of the Indiana National Guard, and those who were full-time career warfighters like Captain Young before he became Senator Young, know that we are deploying too often, too long, too many, at too great a cost. For quite a few years after 9/11, our single biggest development spend was in countries like Afghanistan and Iraq, where the billions we were sending into development and diplomacy really were following the lead dog. We are in a fight. We are in a fight that hasn't stopped, isn't stopping, and isn't slowing. By the way, we have bigger problems. There's this country called China. Don't know if you've heard of it. Country called Russia. Place called North Korea. Place called Iran. All of these are problems. In the meantime, we have huge humanitarian challenges. Ebola, tearing up northeastern DRC. We've got poverty, we have dislocation, we have violence, and we need to find a way to fight smarter and fight better. I've never forgotten my wife's uncle telling me about serving in the South Pacific as a Marine, getting into a huge bar fight with a bunch of guys from the Navy. They're all tearing each other up. They're all tearing each other up. Everyone, fists flying and bar stools going. And a bunch of Japanese Zeros go overhead and they're like, oh, right. Sorry, back to that fight. We have an incredible football team and a decent soccer team and a pretty good lacrosse team. If they were all playing football and you had a quarterback and you had folks going long, folks on the line, folks in the backfield, we'd be playing a good game. But instead we have defense and diplomacy and development. And they don't play as one team. You got these guys playing lacrosse doing diplomacy. You got these guys doing development playing soccer. And you got these guys in the Department of Defense, which, by the way, gets more money than virtually every other agency in the entire federal government combined, right? So if you want to win at a complex game, you need a quarterback and you need to retrain everybody to play the same game. We're not only not playing the same game against the same mission, same opponent, we're fighting each other constantly. So what is the challenge of making this bill law and then making the law matter? It's figuring out who's calling the plays and how do we recognize in advance in a way that requires fewer young men and women to go fight, ways to stop the fight from coming. Every soldier deployed full-time to Afghanistan costs us $1 million a year. That's a huge cost. We can deploy development professionals and diplomats at a dramatically lower cost and with greater impact. But we've all got to be pulling in the same direction, playing the same game, clear about what we're trying to achieve. This is a transparent, accountable, measurable way to repeat the success we had in Colombia over a decade, which required several administrations, several Congresses to sign up for a plan, hold the country accountable, make measured investments, and have real outcomes. We can win, but we are wasting money and lives now because we don't know what fight we're in and we don't know how to win it. There is no strategy to win today. This helps develop a strategy to win.
So what would be early signs of success? The low-hanging fruit, the legislation, let's just say it passes in this calendar year. It can't hurt to hope. And the legislation, thanks to your hard work on it, does spell out, I believe the State Department is the quarterback and does have some deadlines and timelines for certain pieces of action to get things moving. What would you feel good about seeing? What do you want to see in the first let's say 3 years of the implementation to feel like this was the right move. This is going the direction I want it to as authors of this legislation.
I'll grab that for a second if I could. Here's the biggest problem this bill will face is that avoided pain, avoided spending, avoided suffering is very difficult to quantify, mobilize, and inspire people about. There's this other problem going on right now. A plane load of Republican senators and the vice president last weekend, a plane load of Democratic senators this weekend went to the border, to the same place, not with each other, but right. And we're beating each other up endlessly on the floor over this humanitarian crisis at the southern border. No disrespect. Some of us are trying to find a legislative compromise, but it is exceptionally difficult in our polarized politics.
And put me in that some of us category.
Yeah.
All right.
No, that was meant as a some of us.
Yeah.
And there is, I think there's no dispute that the three Northern Triangle countries would meet the definition of fragile states that are under enormous pressure, violence, lack of rule of law, dislocation, driving hundreds and hundreds of thousands of families to make a trek to our southern border in a way that is swamping our ability to respond in a humane and humanitarian way and our ability to keep our borders secure. And this is in some polls, the top issue in the United States today. In 3 years, an approach like this would have made significant progress towards stabilizing countries, restoring some rule of law, restoring some predictability, restoring some transparency, and coordinating a response that was more cost effective, where those of us who are concerned about how much we spend and to what impact could say, okay, this money was not just thrown away and wasted. And those of us who are concerned about border security could say we've gone from over 1 million people showing up at our border to hundreds of thousands, right? A. B, in the Sahel, we would see countries like Nigeria and Cote d'Ivoire come back and say, instead of our northern third being just on the verge of collapse and chaos, stabilizing, improving, and in countries like Burkina Faso, Niger, Mali, we'd hear from station and from governments, wow, this is beginning to get less bad. The problem with the latter, which is where I think we will probably first have the most impact, is your average American doesn't know where a Ouagadougou is. That's okay. But your average American sure as heck knows how many women and children are in detention in McAllen or in Homestead. And your average American sure knows that they don't like the idea that we're spending billions of dollars on an insecure border that is destabilizing our country.
Well, let me offer a response to your question that's more pedestrian. First, I'd like the administration, and this is in no way confined to this administration. This has been going on for generations. But I'd like the administration to hit its deadline. So within a year of passage, I would actually like this administration to have followed the metrics required in the legislation, work with the various stakeholders, and to identify the 5 countries or regions that we're going to focus on with respect to this Fragility Act. Secondarily, I want a robust strategy teased out in consultation with Congress, of course, but we'll have state working with defense, working with USAID to make sure that we really have a coherent and effective strategy here. So those are sort of the deliverables in the near term that I'd like to see, and that's within a year. You count passage, probably 18 months from now. I'm hoping, God willing, if we get this thing passed and signed into law. If I could just build on something that Chris said, I think it's essential. We really owe it to our men and women in uniform to ensure that we have sufficiently incorporated prevention into our overall foreign policy. I recently sat down with Lee Hamilton, and Lee Hamilton said something to me which was incredibly profound. We were talking about one of the areas around the world where our men and women in uniform have been deployed for a period of time, and he says, "Well, I think the threshold question, Todd, for you at this point is would you be willing to die for this strategy? Would you be willing to die for this strategy?" And if the answer is no, then we of course shouldn't ask somebody else to die for this strategy. So if our sort of broader strategy related to violent conflict and violent extremism around the world doesn't include a strong element of prevention. We're not putting real resources behind that prevention and elevating this as a discipline within our federal government. We're failing men and women in uniform. We're failing their families. We're failing the memory of Lance Corporal Alec Turwiski, whose mother I had an opportunity to speak with in the wake of his death on 3rd of September 2012 in Afghanistan. Sandy Turwiski requires that I support initiatives like this so that we won't have to send as many young Marines into conflict zones. And that's, for me, what this is really all about. This is an intersection of good old, Benjamin Franklin, an ounce of prevention, as opposed to a pound of cure on one hand, but it's also about national security brought down to the household level. And better not to fight. We know we have to fight sometimes. We know that we need to be prepared to fight so that we don't have to fight. But we also know that we need to place more emphasis, especially with the growing scholarship in this area that shows that a lack of food, fuel, and medicine leads to radicalization. We've seen that in Yemen. We've seen the second order effects of refugee flows in the wake of conflict in Syria and Burma. We've seen how that leads to the spread of disease across borders. These are very costly in human terms, but they're also very costly to the American people. And it's just a smarter way to go about implementing our foreign policy. And that's why I commend Chris in particular. I mean, I'm up here on an equal plane with Chris, but Chris was he was really the driving force behind this legislation, and I'm proud to have been a part in introducing it. Yeah.
So we're going to have an opportunity for all of you, or some of you at least, to ask questions of the senators as we see if there's anybody who plans to ask such a question. We have two volunteers prepared to present microphones to you. So we will get started here in the front. I don't need a microphone. My voice is quite loud.
You may for C-SPAN.
It actually would be helpful for those watching the live stream. Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Hi, my name is Rain. I am in government contract. One thing that my company really tries to focus on is the 3 Ds of defense, diplomacy, and development. So when you were talking about early signs of success, you were saying that one of the early signs of success that you would like to see is that the administration following metrics, collaborating, and identifying different countries where they'd like to focus on development first and where they believe that they'd get the most, ground when looking at metrics of success. Would each of you be able to point out the 5 countries, or a few countries, doesn't have to be 5, where you believe that we should start? And if you had to put them on this Global Fragility Act, you would feel like they would definitely get the most traction and the most votes among your colleagues. Thank you.
I'll defer to Chris on this one. Yeah.
I'll start by saying, my personal passion is around the Sahel. Having visited each of the main 5 countries that are currently significantly destabilized, at risk from violence, from a lack of governance, transparency, rule of law. There is a wide range of reasons why the 5 countries across sort of the core have been really under assault, both by violent extremism, the ways in which the collapse of Libya, the opening of Gaddafi's armories has led to violent conflict, but also ways in which long unresolved intra-country and regional conflicts, things that are as simple as herders versus, those who are agrarian, and unequal access to both governance resources and natural resources. I'd be thrilled if we had a clear and articulated strategy that held accountable governments to a Millennium Challenge Compact-like framework that says, okay, in the first 5 years, here's these goals. In the second 5 years, here's these goals. And where the buy-in terms of the development trajectory by the partner countries, it's got to be led by them, not by us. Frankly, I'm not going to support throwing bad money after good if we have a government that is unwilling or unable to make needed changes. Second, and Todd made the most important point, which really is the fight in the buildings is going to be the most important initial fight. Really getting state-led, AID informed and defense supported strategy is going to be a huge and challenging fight, and will require active engagement and oversight from folks with a lot of credibility and folks who talk a lot. And we'll see if we can get that done. Just second, one other thing, like the PEPFAR initiative, like the global fight against HIV/AIDS that President Bush launched and led, this imagines a global fund where we are inviting investment and participation and coordination from our key allies. In my most recent visits to countries like Burkina Faso and Niger, you can see that we're doing this, DOD is doing this, and AID is doing this, and the Norwegians are over here, the Brits are over there, and the Japanese are doing this, and the Australians. But with the barest of coordination around a common strategy, all of our core allies are also investing in combating refugee flows and trying to provide for stability and clean water projects and food and fuel projects, green energy projects. But we are far from having a coordinated strategy. The dramatic progress we've made in the work against HIV/AIDS is in no small part because there is a global coordinating function. And in some ways, that's the other piece we haven't addressed yet. We got to get the bill passed first. We got to win the fight in the buildings for some rational strategy. But I know that many of us are hoping to have a force multiplier in the same way that the burdens of the fight in Afghanistan have been shared by all of our NATO allies. We are hoping that the humanitarian, diplomatic, and developmental work, as well as the defense work, whether it's in Central America or in the Sahel or in Southeast Asia, will end up being shared in a coordinated way.
I think it's so important that you brought up this partnership fund established through the legislation. I'm very excited about it. So frequently, I think the United States generously invests in things that must be funded globally in order to enhance our safety and security and protect our national interests. But oftentimes we crowd out monies from multilateral institutions or partner countries, even the private or philanthropic sectors. And we have created an instrument to crowd in money. The monies we've allocated could just be the seed capital for a much broader effort, inviting G7 countries, maybe GCC countries with their very large sovereign wealth funds. One can always hope, or the World Bank, of which we are the largest shareholder, and yet I've been briefed consistently we're not the best at advancing our own interests through that institution as compared to other countries. So these are all opportunities that I see with creation of this new instrument to invite third-party funding as force multipliers. Yeah.
There let's do, since we're running close on time, there are 3 hands. Why don't each of you ask your question, and we'll do our best to have the senators. Do you have a microphone already? No. Have the senators tackle them. Okay, since the woman in the back has the microphone first, please ask your question.
Hi there, Teresa Welsh, reporter with DevEx. Now that the bill is out of SFRC, wondering if you have a sense of when we might see a floor vote. Thank you.
Okay, next question. Sir, do you mind standing up just so we can?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
Jim
Sure.
White,
You
I'm a former State Department of the USA official, now a student of fertility. We always tend to invest in the countries that are on fire, and prevention implies a willingness and to set up this fund that contemplates investment in countries that are not on fire to prevent the fire from breaking out.
Mhm.
And in my own experience, I've seen, for example, the northern tier countries, we would invest and then we would stop investing. Then we would invest and then we would stop investing. Cuban Missile Crisis, Sandinista Revolution, those make and then the end of the Cold War, it stops. How have you thought about in this legislation the time frame that it takes to achieve societal change and the political ability to invest in countries that are not on fire, that are to make prevention work.
Okay, and last question. There was another, oh, right here. Sorry.
Hi, Linda Weisler Hughes, retired from the National Intelligence Council. One of the things I'm sure you've thought of, but one of the issues I think is very important is development of a rule of law in these countries. So what you're saying is very encouraging to me, because I did a lot of work on counter radicalization, and that's just one of the things that we found very important. Thank you.
You want to take those? And then
Feel
I'll
free
wrap
to,
up?
feel free to take one of them, two, whatever. No need to take all three.
Well, I was gonna let Chris share the
You
good
can
news. Whispered to me.
Yeah.
Last thing I heard, the bill's going to be hotline
Hotline today.
which means it's moving forward.
That means the beginning of the very hard work of facing down the 4 members of SFRC who voted against it, several of whom will now almost certainly hold it. And as was the case with the BUILD Act in the last Congress, with exactly the same players, one different, that then means months of close-in work with very well known to everybody here senators who frankly vote against anything that expands foreign aid. We're then going to have to figure out ways to get them to release their holds. But it's a fairly identifiable, in fact, publicly known based on their votes in the committee group of Republican senators, one of whom holds absolutely every bill. And I think we can clear another of whom Chairman Graham is optimistic he can clear, 2 others who are going to be quite difficult. This is what we do. This is the hard buttonhole him on the floor, have him say no, find a way to work to yes, figure out what we have to do, give him some vote on something we don't like and don't care about. Remember the tax treaties? Yay. That was this week's fun. So, I mean, but to move this forward, we're out of the House.
7 years.
We can get out of the Senate. Yeah, let's not encourage everybody.
But
this is hard. This is hard work. How can you help? Funny you should mention.
Give us some homework.
Well, there's these guys. It's Senator Brasso, Senator Cruz, Senator Paul, and Senator Johnson. At this point, we don't know this yet, and that's not for sure. But the point of running a hotline, what that means is literally every senator, through our incredibly capable and talented staff, get asked, are you willing to consent to this bill passing today? I think the power of prayer is significant, so I welcome prayers. Please pray that there will be a unanimous, I'm actually not joking. Please pray that there will be a unanimous consent vote and that, Spirit will move and we're done. That would be fabulous.
How do I improve on that? Yeah, you see, calling on the power of the Almighty.
Well,
you can also flood the phone lines.
There you go.
If you want a backup plan.
Pray always. Yeah. If fails, call from constituent. Yeah. That's the challenge.
Phone's ringing. So either of the
activate your faith, right?
Yeah. The other 2 questions, if either of you want to take a stab at those, the rule of law and
firefighting,
working with countries who aren't quite on fire.
Well, the rule of law will be presumably incorporated into the strategy as well as the country plans, and so thank you for your service and your important work, and know that that's one of the reasons that we've included this sort of whole of government approach in addressing fragility. With respect to the sort of time frame here, you want to take a stab at that one, Senator?
I mean, this is a challenge. To your point about firefighting, imagine a society where all you did was pour huge amounts of tax money into bigger and bigger fire trucks and bigger fire stations, but you didn't have a building inspection process. You didn't have a code process. People were allowed to build homes out of whatever materials they wanted to, regardless of how many fires they caused. I was a county elected official for 10 years. I spent huge amounts of time. Here's one of the great stories that never gets covered. The number of fires in residences in the United States has gone down dramatically. So much so that, frankly, we need firefighters really more to respond to vehicle crashes than home fires because the numbers have gone down so sharply. How did that happen? Codes, building codes. That's what rule of law is. When you focus on things like rule of law, access to clean water, food resiliency, a woman-led development strategy rather than just focusing on defense and violence. You improve building codes, you steadily but quietly improve the safety and resiliency of the society, and then, surprise, you need fewer firefighters. Now, all of us like to watch the firefighters go and pull out the hose and the fire, but eventually, as a society, you get tired of spending $700 billion a year. And although the deployment ceremony may be stirring and the flags will wave and the band will play, those 500 young men and women, they are tired of going overseas a year at a time every third year. And I don't know a member of Congress who wouldn't prefer to welcome home troops from Afghanistan and Iraq than go to another deployment ceremony. So when are we going to change strategies? When we get tired of the deployment ceremonies and we welcome home ceremonies gets a higher priority. Timeline, at least a decade. Plan Colombia I met with one of the architects of Plan Colombia yesterday. It only worked because it was reliable across several administrations, across several Congresses. We cannot legally bind several Congresses, but what are the odds that the state of Indiana will be so wise as to continue welcoming the blessing of the service of Captain, now Senator Todd Young? I hope very high. I hope very high. And I am happy to be on the record saying Todd has been an amazing blessing to serve with. His heart and his fight on the Yemen humanitarian issue was outstanding, was the strongest in the Senate. You have sent us someone who understands what it means to invest in strong national defense, but also understands what it means to value human life and to fight for humanitarian relief. That is a great partner to have in this work. So thank you. Let me also say in closing, Notre Dame is a great blessing. I have a fantastic intern this year who happens to be a Notre Dame student. And of course, my own son continues to enjoy the blessings of a challenging education. If we are going to value peace building, we will do so only out of a common and shared view of the world, which is a view inspired by the faith that motivates the vast majority of Americans. As elected officials, we are responsible for valuing those who have no faith or who come from many different faiths. But the thing that makes America the light of the world and the thing that makes us special is the ways in which we have just emptied ourselves in service to the world in trying to combat violence, disease, and disruption. This is a smart, bipartisan, sustainable strategy to show the best of our values. Let's do it. Thank you.
On that note, thank you both for your time, for your leadership, and know that in addition to the Keough School at Notre Dame, most, if not all, of the individuals here this morning are cheering you on and more than ready to roll up their sleeves
and call
and do the hard work of implementation. So academia has a lot to offer with the research that will be needed to prove success, making the case that when buildings don't burn, we want to continue to do what we're doing to make that the case. So call on all of us to stay with you during this fight and beyond. So thank you again for your time and leadership.
Thank you, Maura. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me? Okay, good morning. It's a pleasure. Yes. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today to address the critical issue of state fragility and violent conflict. I'd like to thank the Keough School, Dean Appleby, Maura Porcelli, and the dedicated staff for this invitation, as well as the Keough School continued collaboration with my bureau, the Bureau of Conflict and Stabilization Operations, or what we call CSO at the State Department. It's also a pleasure to have heard Senator Coons, Senator Todd, to see colleagues such as Admiral Zimmer, Nancy Lindbergh, the president of USIP, and others here who have worked so hard on this issue and nobly of global fragility. We are here today because the demand for strategic action on state fragility is growing. This includes, as we discussed, the Bipartisan Global Fragility Act that Senator Coons and Young talked about, the USIP Task Force on Extremism in Fragile States, the UN World Bank Pathways for Peace report, the ongoing development of the World Bank's Fragility, Conflict, and Violence Strategy, and the State Department's ongoing work on state fragility as well, to name a few. Underlying this demand is the shared recognition that fragility and conflict remain pervasive across the globe. Although there's been a decline in interstate war since World War II, violent conflict inside fragile states continues, and it's expected to increase. More than half the conflicts that have ended since the early 2000s have returned to violence in 7 years. The USIP task force found that 99% of all deaths in the past 17 years have occurred in countries that are in conflict, despite the war on terror. Further data that we've conducted shows that the link between state fragility, violent conflict, and mass atrocities. According to CSO's most recent Global Atrocity Index, the vast majority of countries that we've identified at risk for mass atrocities are fragile states. Many are currently experiencing conflict, or they have previously experienced mass atrocities. Our early warning indicators also show that mass atrocities are most likely to occur in conflicts involving religious and ethnic violence. So state fragility is at the center of all of these trends. And by fragility, I'm referring to a state's vulnerability to armed conflict, violence, transnational threats, and its inability to be effective or have legitimate institutions. There's also weak social cohesion. We also know that state fragility therefore undermines U.S. national security interests. This is a national security priority. Terrorist groups exploit poor governance, social divisions recruit new members. Instability enables the spread of global pandemics and diseases. Internal conflicts spur migration, threatening surrounding states. They disrupt commerce. They strain our partners' capacity to cooperate on mutual priorities. And as the USIP task force showed, countries like Iran, China, and Russia fuel or exploit state fragility and fragmentation to advance their own agendas while undermining US national interests. The examples are numerous. Take fragile states like Iraq, Syria, and Niger, all of which I have visited during the last 9 months since I've assumed my position. These countries are far from our shores, but yet the volatile conflicts within them have had a negative impact on our security interests and our regional allies and partners. For instance, Niger, which is a key US partner and a linchpin to stability in the Sahel, is strained by violent extremist attacks on 3 borders. It's the primary transit route for tens and thousands of West Africans who annually attempt to migrate north through the Mediterranean to Europe. During my trip to Niger this March, I visited the southern border town of Diffa, which is a central target of Boko Haram recruitment and attacks. And I spoke with the governor and local leaders, tribal leaders, religious leaders, to try to identify what the root causes of war, why people joined, and what we need to do to get them to leave Boko Haram. We talked about how we can most effectively target ways to address societal resilience and focus on those networks. Now, the US government recognizes that our national security imperatives to respond to state fragility through the dual lens of conflict prevention and stabilization. A significant effort, as we talked about this morning, is the Global Fragility Act, which calls for the creation of a US government global strategy on fragility and violent conflict. I appreciate Congress's commitment to a targeted, whole of government approach to fragility that prioritizes prevention by addressing the root causes of conflict. We spoke this morning about strategies and demonstration countries and ways that we should move forward. I would like to briefly give to you an understanding of what we already are doing at the State Department to address the issue of global fragility in preparation for the act, but as part of our everyday work in addressing conflict and stabilization. Most recently, our director of policy planning, Dr. Kyron Skinner, addressed the issue and the administration's approach to state fragility at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Some of our key points of this approach are expending resources strategically that are in places of U.S. national interest, prioritizing prevention to get ahead of costly crises, recognizing the political nature of conflict, countering our adversaries' efforts to sow or exploit fragility, and urging burden sharing and coordination. Now, we also have 2 complementary efforts that are going on at the State Department. The first is our Strategic Prevention Project, which again is an initiative to better identify and how we target our foreign assistance to prevent violent conflict in fragile states. This is being led by the Bureau of Foreign Assistance, and I'm pleased that CSO can provide support to that. This final project will be released in the coming weeks, and it will inform our future budget, policy, and strategy processes. It identifies what works and what does not work. And as many of you may know, the second is the Stabilization Assistance Review, or the SAR. We also again reaffirm the principles that you're going to be hearing throughout: targeted assistance, clear political outcomes, local partnership, burden sharing. The SAR also positions the State Department as the lead when it comes to stabilizing conflict-prevented areas. There's three other parts of the Global Fragility Act that I'd like to just mention, and this is where my bureau, CSO, has particularly focused on and where we see us moving forward. This addresses prevention and the root causes, the analytics to provide early warning, and again, building on our opportunities for burden sharing. As we discussed this morning, we talked about the costly, Senator Kuhn and Senator Todd talked about the costly human part of prevention. This is tantamount. Now, when we asked, why is it important? According to the World Bank Pathway for Peace report, for each $1 invested in prevention-related activities, the international community can save between 2 and 4 times that over the long run in the cost of responding to conflict. So we seek to invest on the front end of the conflict cycle so that we can avoid the kinetic activity on the back end. One of the ways that we have been focusing on how to address root causes is in preventing or countering violent extremism in targeted countries. We work closely, CSO works closely with the Bureau of Counterterrorism at the State Department to analyze local conditions, understand the root causes, and then devise programs that are specific to each locality. This effort is important, and you're going to hear me say this again, and understanding what is a root cause, a direct root cause, and that is different from what is tangentially related and what we may think is a cause. What CSO is doing right now is implementing what we're calling a global CVE baseline studies of violent extremism in 6 priority countries. So we already have a priorities countries project. And I recently returned from the Philippines, where CSO has undertaken a year-long study, it's completed, on what the root causes and some of the resiliencies of violent extremism in the southern Philippines. And we worked with NGOs, civil society, and the Philippine government officials to share our results, which will then inform programs. But one of our key finders, as many of you may know, findings is that the drivers are localized, that you can go from one town and even a street over and you will have different drivers. So this requires us being very nuanced. But we also found that there is no direct causal link between poverty and violent extremism in these locations. Economic conditions certainly matter, but they coincide with other variables. What we found in this particular case was that certain types of madrasa education, exposure to violence mattered. And also, again, certain types of economic conditions. So we have to be very careful when we talk about root causes, that we have to do the work and get down and do the nuanced studies in these pilot studies. Secondly, and this goes into my second point, is prevention requires early warning, and we talked about it this morning, metrics to measure results. Our Bureau, again, has an advanced data analytics team. I'm really pleased that we're developing this further with what we're calling the Instability Monitoring and Assessment Platform, or IMAP. And this is a new tool. We're assessing conflict trends, forecasting potential atrocities, conducting geospatial analysis, so we can get at the very measurement tools that this bill is talking about. Now, these types of forecasting and analyses are critical, because we have to also know that any assistance that we provide and the way that we approach this is not open-ended. That yes, we must get at fragile states. Yes, we know that this is long-term. We must be agile. We must continuously assess, adjust where necessary, and also end a program where we show that there are no clear, measurable signs of success over a determined period. We have an obligation to be more effective with our outcomes and also to use judiciously U.S. taxpayer dollars. This is equally important as we go forward with the Global Fragility Act. To this end, we are burden sharing, but working closely with our partners at USAID, at the Department of Defense. I'm really pleased that CSO has placed our stabilization advisors at the COCOMs, for example, in the J5. We've got somebody at AFRICOM. We're now placing in UCOM, INDOPACOM, and moving others to other COCOMs so that we can enhance the 3Ds alongside our USAID partners. We've developed a guide with USAID, DOD, and the United States Institute of Peace on how to strategically monitor and evaluate stabilization missions. And this will be ready at the end of 2019. Finally, third, we all talked about burden sharing. It's important to know that we have some of these mechanisms in place. How do we leverage our host country buy-in and burden share with our partners? Now, there's an important group, I don't know if many of you know, it's called the Stabilization Leaders Forum. CSO has, as a co-lead, we formed that with our British counterparts years back. But we have 8 like-minded stabilization partners: Australia, Canada, Denmark, France, Germany, the Netherlands, the United States, and the European Union as an observer nation. We are the secretariat of this group, but we meet annually, we converse monthly, and I'm pleased to state that we just endorsed a first of its kind, a memorandum on effective principles for conflict stabilization. So we have this group, we are working with this group to burden share on future conflict prevention and stabilization operations. So I look forward and I encourage us to use the kinds of groups and develop the kinds of groups that are already in place that the Global Fragility Act is talking about. So I just want to conclude, the need for a whole of government approach is clear. We must pursue targeted, disciplined, and effective approaches. We will work in places that matter to us, that are our national security priorities. We will work through local partners. We will require burden sharing with our allies and donors. We will build on what already is in place so that we can avoid duplication and make sure we're adding value. And we must link our programs to policy objectives and continuously measure and determine impact. I think that's an agreement in the bill. I think many of us who are in this business know that this is the way forward. I hope today's events bring new and creative ideas to our important work so that you all can help us devise effective strategies, policies, and programs. In closing, I'd like to ask you and those who are going to be on the panels and continue with today's discussion to think through 3 points or questions I'll have, because a lot now is the devil's in the details. One is we talk about root causes. I would be very interested to hone in on that. Are you talking about the root causes of state fragility or the root causes of extremism? How are you going to measure direct causality as opposed to tangential causality? Because again, we have a tendency to automatically link poverty to root causes when in some cases it's not. So we're looking for this kind of detail. Secondly, what does success look like? We talked about it this morning. When does this end? What does a good ending look like to these programs? What can we realistically change and what can we not? We have to, being aspirational is extremely important. It's important to address these challenges, but fragile states also have institutional constraints, cultural, historical legacies, structural legacies that may not be able to be changed in 10 years. So understanding what our limitations are, what we realistically can change, and what is unlikely to change in the medium to long term. And finally, again, please look at what is already taking place in these places. We don't want to duplicate efforts. We do want to effectively use resources. Are there 4 of our other partner countries that are already working in country X? We're already implementing 5 of the 8 stabilization assistance review countries in Africa. So do we need more pilot countries in one place if we've had it there? It doesn't mean we don't do it, but make sure that we are carefully looking at what already is in place by our interagency partners, but but also by our international partners so that we can more effectively use our resources and realize more effective outcomes. Thank you very much. And I really wish you a great, productive day and look forward to your results and your findings. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, everyone. It's truly an honor to be here with such a distinguished panel. I'm Uzra Zaya, the CEO and President of the Alliance for Peace Building. I'm thrilled to be here with a group of senior leaders who, in my view, really cover the spectrum, comprising the 3Ds, as well as the big P, peace building, for those not in the know. We have with us senior leaders from diplomacy, from defense, from development, because I would make the point that development does not just comprise the US government. Frontline peace builders like Mercy Corps and Search for Common Ground are vital actors and partners in this effort. So I'm hoping we can have a rich exchange on taking in what we've heard from the senators and the assistant secretary in terms of the call to action, the imperative for a shift in approach in fragility, and maybe talk about how do we really carry that out? How do we operationalize this? So going down the line, maybe as an introduction, I think you all have everyone's bios in the program. I would note that for Search for Common Ground, we have Mike Jobbins, their Vice President for Partnerships and Global Affairs. Starting with Pete, representing the State Department. Could all of you just say, how do you see the key components that we need to improve U.S. government stabilization and prevention efforts? And then we'll get into the deeper issues.
Sure. Thank you. So 2018 was a really big year for those of us that work in stabilizing fragile states. And I'm hopeful after hearing the panel of senators and also Assistant Secretary Natali emphasize the importance of the next steps, that 2019 is going to be an even bigger year. 2018, we had the Stabilization Assistance Review, and we had the Special Inspector General of Afghan Reconstruction, their report on stabilization. And I'd like to start by just reading a passage from the key conclusions that the SIGAR found. It says, during the 2009 Afghanistan strategy reviews, President Obama and his civilian and military advisors set in motion a series of events that fostered unrealistic expectations of what could be achieved. They also ensured the U.S. government stabilization strategy would not succeed, first with rapid surge and then rapid transition. Under immense pressure to quickly stabilize insecure districts, U.S. government agencies spent far too much money, far too quickly, in a country woefully unprepared to absorb it. Money spent was often the metric of success. And as a result, programming sometimes exacerbated conflicts, enabled corruption, and bolstered support for insurgents. That's not good news. And for those of us now tasked with the step forward, how do you improve on that step and make sure that we're not making the same mistakes in the past? And I think the key one that stands out there for me is money is the metric of success. And I think when lawmakers and policy leaders in the executive branch are under pressure to perform very quickly, the key thing that everybody's thinking about is we have to come up with dollars that we have to spend and get out the door. That demonstrates our success and commitment to solving whatever problem that is. But we have to really consider what those limitations are. And I'd like to go over a few of those that have been specifically mentioned about the SAR, but to emphasize those very precisely. First, the SAR criteria establishes that we have to have local reliable partners. We have to have security of the operating environment. We have to have the predetermined political objectives that we're working towards. We have to have measurable results. But I think one of the most important limitations is the fact that the American people right now have no appetite for large-scale reconstruction. There's no appetite for endless nation building. We really have to define very specific goals of what we're trying to achieve. I was really encouraged by Senator Coons' mention of siloing when he spoke and talking about that this is not just going to be everybody gets out and everybody does a bunch of stuff. And I think that's one of the things that we have to be very cautious of. Spending more does not mean achieving more. And I'll give an example from our bureau that we've seen is if you look at the Western Balkans, there were projects in the past that would spend $20 million on a raspberry farm that was supposed to prevent extremism. Well, now that's created another series of issues that we have to deal with. On the other end of the spectrum, we can actually spend $2,000 with a local mayor in training him on mechanisms that he can actually employ for early warning and for deterring recruitment. I'm not going to filibuster here, so I'll just end quickly with 3 cultural problems that I would like to address that I think we, as a team, have to work together to achieve. The first is that whole of government and by, with, and through are not a panacea for security and stabilization. We've already talked about spending our way to success. It's just not going to happen. Less, in this case, and many times can mean more. Senator Young mentioned evidence-based policymaking and data-driven results. This is so key. One of the areas that we've worked in is Nigeria. And there are these common narratives that people would like to put out that desertification is actually driving all of the violent extremism that we're starting to see surge. Well, that's simply not true. When we can actually analyze the data, we can look at the visuals and see that the Sahel is greening, that the crop cover is increasing, the rainfall is increasing. It doesn't fit the narrative that maybe someone would like to say that desertification is driving extremism. So to Dr. Natali's point, we have to make sure that we know what those specific root causes actually are. And the third one is risk aversion. We have an extremely risk-averse culture at the State Department. One of the findings of the Stabilization Assistance Review was that the State Department needed to be the lead. Well, if we're going to be the lead, we need to be in the field. And co-deployments with the military are essential, and we can't let the bureaucracy keep us from getting out there. So as a culture within the department, we are going to have to become more comfortable with expanding our comfort zone. So I think that's where I'll stop for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Pat, would you like to weigh in from the Department of Defense perspective, but maybe building on what Pete mentioned with respect to the SAR? I mean, 2 points. How is that working in terms of the real integration between the agencies? But also, how do you keep the focus with respect to other issues overtaking the real sustained long-term approach needed as articulated in the Fragility Act and the Stabilization Assistance Review?
Sure. Well, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks to the Keough Center for having us all here today. It's a pleasure to be with colleagues from the 3D community and across all the other academia, NGO, think tank community here to discuss an important topic. So I wanted to bring up 3 points. First, how we got to where we are today. Second, what the SAR means to DoD and U.S. government writ large. And then third, kind of going forward. So within the Department of Defense, we routinely look at how we improve stabilization. And the last big effort when this was done was back in 2016. And many of the crowd that are in the crowd here today were there at that seminal event, from Kevin Melton and Sarah Reckless and Peter Caranto, and I think Raphael Carlin was here, and Jim Ruff from USIP. But we convened this really robust group of state aid and then across all the other branches that I just talked about to come together and talk about stabilization. After 15 years, this body of scholarship had evolved to understand, with a lot of experience on the ground, what we were doing well, what we weren't doing well, how money was being spent, and how to go forward. So that was in September of 2016. From that germinated a paper that was laid the baseline for the SAR that was approved at the assistant secretary level, because we had this thing called an election upcoming in 2 months. And we knew that whoever was going to be elected, the folks coming in to lead our different departments in the agency, were going to have to understand where the evolution of the thinking on stabilization had evolved to. So we had a paper that was written for the transition teams as they all came on board. Again, at the assistant secretary level, it was approved and blessed, and then that helped inform everybody as they came on board after the election. So within DOD, when Secretary Mattis came on, if you remember, he was confirmed pretty quickly. And the day after the inauguration, he was in place. And during his preparation for his testimony, back even before the inauguration, he got IW, irregular warfare, and how stabilization fits within that. And like other secretaries of defense before him, to get back to Senator Kuhn's point, we've argued repeatedly and vigorously for more funding for state and AID. So I just want to mention that because within Department of Defense, with the national under great power competition and high-end conflict and recapitalizing all these major equipment programs we have, stabilization can get overlooked or lost a little bit. And I also think there's some lingering effects from many that have followed this topic that are still out there that they don't understand. Evolution has happened. There's a lot that's improved on stabilization that's contained in the SAR. So just really quick, what does the SAR mean for DOD in particular? I'd like to highlight a couple things. First, that it's a political endeavor. Second, there's a common definition across the interagency for what stabilization means. We're all talking off the same sheet of music. It's working by, with, and through with a small footprint of forces on the ground and local legitimate authorities and partners to effect stabilization in consolidating military gains. It introduces this very important concept of defense support to stabilization, much like defense support to civil authority, which we already use here in the homeland when a governor needs support in the aftermath of a disaster. But defense support to stabilization codifies really important internal to DOD that the State Department's in the lead, USAID is the lead implementing agency, and DOD is there to support. This also triggered, in kind of boring DOD speak, the rewrite of what we call DOD Directive 3000.05 stabilization. It was written in 2005. It was written again in 2009, and then we just had it published thereafter. The SAR was published in December of 2018 is when it finally came on board. So the Defense Department, it operates on orders, task organization, and directives and instructions. So we argued pretty vigorously with then Deputy Secretary Shanahan to make it a directive, which has a lot more meaning and import within the department. He was on this quest to cut in half the number of directives within the Department of Defense, but we got him to accept that this is important enough that we'll make it a directive, and that was published in last December, complementing the SAR. So this is really important to the services and combatant commands. It kind of lessens a number of tasks we had been doing within stabilization, recognizing the import of State Department being in the lead and aid as the lead implementing agency. It also make sure that our commands understand the stabilization is not just in the aftermath of conflict, but can be planned in all phases of operations, like we're doing now with these stabilization annexes in the 11 countries that Secretary Natali mentioned. It reinvigorated our theater civil affairs planning teams that are combatant commands, where a lot of the planning on stabilization and thinking is ongoing. And it's good to see that we have 3D counterparts in the combatant commands, like also was mentioned, from both AID and state. There's a couple of things that still need to happen with the SAR, though. The co-deployment that Pete talked about is important. So that's one thing we're working. We're also working with our committees to get a legislative budget proposal to give DOD authority in the immediate aftermath of conflict. We still don't have the authority or funding to do stabilization. And so that's something that we're still working with. And hopefully this NDAA will allow us to have about a $25 million fund that can be spent with the agreement of state and AID to conduct stabilization where it's agreed upon. The other thing is that we will have to continually educate those within the department. You're just seeing this with the routine summer changeover as people come and go about what stabilization is, because there is this China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. How are we getting, all these priorities? The Secretary of the Army is now the Secretary of Defense on long-range precision strike and aviation upgrade for rotary wing and all these other big capital investments. Stabilization doesn't come with a lot of fancy toys. It's more about being creative and intellectually savvy and, affecting this on the ground with partners. So that's a continual challenge. We do have some really good recent senior leaders in place, though. General Townsend, who just took over AFRICOM, commanded the task force that was in Iraq and Syria. He was followed by General Paul Funk, who's now the commander of U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, who wrote a really seminal end-of-tour report to Secretary Mattis about the importance of stabilization being the way forward. We have another guy named Walt Hyatt, who is the commander of the 10th Mountain Division in Baghdad during the work in Iraq back 2 years ago, who's the director of the Army staff. And then you have this complement of colonels and lieutenant colonels and majors across the service that have grown up with this and understand that we just can't shoot our way out to victory, in all these places where we operate. So it fits within the National Defense Strategy. Secretary West, before he left government, we did write an irregular warfare annex. It's classified, though. It doesn't get a lot of press, so to say, but it does recognize the importance of everything we're doing in this space within the department. And then just, we can talk a little bit about this later if there's questions, but this is all happening on the ground, coincidentally, not planned whatsoever with what's going on in Syria in the Northeast. We have just reintroduced our Syria Transition Assistance Response Team into the Kobani area. That's a state and aid team that is working with the command or civil affairs teams to implement all these critical, essential functions that have to happen in the immediate aftermath of all the fighting there. So they're doing yeoman's work. They left for a little while, came back, and we're hoping that continues. But that's a really interesting laboratory of what's happening in space right now. I'll end there.
Thank you, Pat. I think this is a great moment to turn to DAFNA. And I'd like to point out, with respect to the Global Fragility Act, there's really a unique history where it was driven by civil society, and particularly Mercy Corps. DAFNA addressing the question at the outside in terms of what is needed to improve U.S. government stabilization and conflict prevention. I think we've heard great input from Pete and Pat in terms of what's being done. But can you give us your perspective and also how civil society fits in?
Great, thank you very much. And first, I'd like to thank Notre Dame Dean and Tamora for hosting us. How fantastic to partner with you. And particularly pleased, Ezra, that you're here moderating us, because from the beginning, Mercy Corps has worked with the Alliance for Peace Building, and Richard Blake and Laura and Liz and your team have been drivers as the advocates of this coalition. So thanks again to all of those who worked on the bill. It was really a team effort. Mercy Corps, as folks know, sort of specializes in the most violent places on earth. We work in 40 countries, but 17 of our countries are labeled, have the notorious label of being in those countries that are sort of ranked by the UN as the most violent countries on earth. So that's where we are. That's where we operate. That's where our teams are day to day. And what I like to do, just to sort of bring it down from the level and perspective of the field from our Mercy Corps teams, is elucidate a little bit of what these peace building programs actually do, right? We haven't talked about that a lot this morning, but really give you a feel for what we at Mercy Corps are doing on the ground, what we will do with the new funds, what we will do in support of USAID, state, and DoD if the passes. And again, we are just one implementer. I'm sharing our approach. There are many different NGOs who have similar. We look at peace building through three technical objectives, theories of change. One, we're looking at trying to rebuild relationships. In a lot of these violent, conflict-affected places, societal and communal relationships have been fractured. There are tensions, whether on ethno or religious grounds, political fractions, between communities and government. So there's a lot of effort in our programs to try to sew together some of these broken relationships. Second, in addition to that, at the same time, we are trying to address the actual grievances that are driving the conflict. Overwhelmingly, we find that the grievances are rooted, as others have mentioned, in the own lived experiences of injustice, such as discrimination, corruption, abuse by security forces. Armed groups often prey on young people who've lived through these experiences, who have these grievances. So we're looking very specifically at what the grievances are, and then building the programs to adjust. And third, at the same time, again, layered on top of those first two technical approaches, we're teaching negotiation and mediation skills. We're teaching them to young people. We're teaching them to local government. We're teaching them to officials, the people who take the trash, the people who ask for the taxes, the people who to provide services. We're helping communities and governments work together on early warning systems to try to let everyone know when maybe will burn over, when the fire is beginning, to use the metaphor that the senators have used. And these early response systems are really neighborhood by neighborhood. So folks who are worried can contact each other and say, a bunch of armed gangs or armed guys are beginning to instigate some violence. Let's all work together and stop it right now. So those are the three theoretical, technical approaches. Let me bring it down to one case study, which is Kenya, because I think it will show how this works in practice. As folks here know, in 2007 in Kenya, armed groups of young people stirred up by local politicians killed more than 1,500 people and drove more than 500,000 people from their homes across the country, and the violence associated with the elections. This was between 2007, late 2007, 2008. When I was in the Obama administration at the National Security Council, in the years following, there was a deep preventative approach. This had really scarred Kenyan politics, that had scarred and fractured East Africa, and there was an intensity of prevention to prevent this from happening again. We saw ahead to 2013, the elections were coming up, and across USAID and state and DoD, we worked together with our embassy in Nairobi to develop a multi-layered strategy to engage the youth directly in the 2 years in the run-up for the elections, to address all the different grievances and all the different rifts that had led to the 2007 violence. And so USAID was the driver of this in terms of implementation, and there was around $50 to $60 million. So a lot from USAID terms, but not a lot in the sort of trillion metrics that we heard earlier this morning. Mercy Corps received some of this funding, a tiny amount of this funding, and we were working on the ground. And there was two main programs that we worked on in the run-up to the 2013 elections in Kenya that we believe were deeply successful, and we have replicated around Africa because we saw our outcomes in our measurement and evaluation. One was a Yes Youth Can program, which helped youth respond to the violence and become leaders in their communities, from the Nairobi slums to outside in more agricultural communities. And the second was called Local Empowerment for Peace, the LEAP program. Through these initiatives, we trained hundreds of women, youth groups, how to prevent violence in their homes and their communities, how to map potential hotspots, how to intervene to stop local incidences from escalating. We developed a new Kenyan youth movement, the National Youth Bungee Association, which grew to 500,000 participants. And we partnered and helped build the capacity of many, many, many local civil society groups. There's probably 20, but I'll list 5 that folks have heard of. We helped build up the Africa Sports and Talents Empowerment Program, which leveraged Kenyan sports leaders and celebrities to be leaders in their communities trying to de-escalate violence. We helped build up Ushahidi, which leveraged innovative technologies like SMS texting to help with community leaders' interactive mapping of the hotspots and information collecting. And we helped start Nairobi's Homeboys radio station, which still exists today, which is a youth-focused media station that leverages various kind of programming to address youth all over Kenya. So I wanted to dig in deep into the Kenya example because I think it's important to kind of dig into one very violent incident. You can never dispositively argue that any one thing caused the lack of violence in 2013. But, as everyone knows, the 2013 elections in Kenya were much more peaceful than the previous ones, and subsequent elections have gone much better. In conclusion, Mercy Corps is continuing to replicate some of these technical approaches. We're very proud that the British government has just afforded us a £15 million award to work in 5 countries across East Africa on CVE, on countering violent extremism. We're going to replicate some of our work in Kenya. And key to our programming here will be the accumulation of our evidence of what works and under what conditions. And we're particularly going to research over the next 5 years in East Africa the combination of the development interventions and the top-down interventions from government, and how these two can creatively, in sync, work to de-escalate violence. So I'll end there, and then happy to answer more questions.
Right. Thank you so much, Daphna. I know we want to turn to Q&A, but I just want to give Mike an opportunity. Best elevator pitch, Mike. If you can give us just one real-life example of a best practice from Search for Common Ground with respect to everything we've discussed.
Sure. Thanks, Ezra. And, I think as I look at this, I spent most of my career in Africa with Search before coming back to DC. And my last assignment was in Equateur province in DRC. At that time, there had been a charismatic preacher had mobilized an insurgency, recruited hundreds of combatants. They killed thousands of people in somewhat graphic manners. 100,000 people had fled to the neighboring countries. And we had a charismatic and sort of visionary grants officer from UNHCR, the refugee agency, who convinced his hierarchy that of the millions of dollars they were spending on dealing with the refugees in the neighboring countries, they should take 400,000 of that and spend that on trying to support the people who are still living in that province to solve the problem that had caused them to flee. And so he approached us, he approached me and some of our colleagues. We talked it through, and I led our team out there. We led a series of sort of mediations supporting the traditional leaders, supporting the women's leaders, working with the local government, the parts that hadn't fled, and supporting in building radio stations to reduce rumors. And at the end, 3 years later, an agreement was signed. A series of agreements were signed between people. A reconciliation process and accountability process was put into place. And three years after people had fled, all 100,000 people who had gone into refugee camps were back home, and they're back to this day. The average Congolese refugee spends more than 7 years outside of the country, not only often living in abominable conditions, but on the dime of philanthropists, taxpayers, and well-wishing people around the world who are dedicating those resources there when they're not, dedicating them somewhere else. And it just struck me how much, when I came back to Washington, how much of our system is built around coping with problems rather than solving them. Our entire architecture is built around band-aids and bullets. Either we send in peacekeepers or the American military, as Senator Coons was saying, or we deal with refugee flows, or we deal with humanitarian aid. And while that marks our generosity, that can mark our courage and our commitment to service, it doesn't demonstrate who Americans are as problem solvers, and it doesn't reflect the world or the 800 searchers, 95% of whom are working in their home countries. It doesn't reflect the world we see, and it doesn't reflect the world we want. And so when this kind of legislation is considered to give more flexibility, to enable a more long-term approach, and to give what I had lunch with a Chaldean priest who had fled the Nineveh Plains in Iraq yesterday, and he said one of the challenges of working with the U.S. government is that there's a tendency to put processes over people. And if our assistance and our commitment to these places doesn't begin with the community and begin with everyone who's a stakeholder in the conflict that caused the suffering in the first place, and if it begins from the top in our silos and the DoD this and the USAID that, and it doesn't reflect the reality and the hope and what's working in those places, we're never going to succeed, and we haven't succeeded. There hasn't been a peacekeeping mission, hasn't ended since I was 15 years old. The military intervention hasn't ended since I was 15 years old. If I look at the places that are fragile today, they're fragile 15 years. Everything that was fragile 15 years ago is fragile today. And everything, and we just keep adding to the list, and we never cross one off. So I'm looking forward to this piece of legislation, and I'm looking forward to this effort to rethink a bit the way we tackle these kind of problems.
Thank you. I think all of you have given the audience a great deal of fodder to respond to. So why don't we open the floor to questions? We'll take up to 3. And if you're directing your question to a particular person, if you can please point them out. Let's see. Great. We have Peter Coranto from the State Department. Welcome, Peter.
Thanks, Uzra. It's great to be here, of course. Great to see all of our panelists. I wanted to ask about the importance of the security sector. Daphne, you pointed out something that in the work we did on the Stabilization Assistance Review, as well as our forthcoming Strategic Prevention Project, we've identified, which is that the role of security actors and security forces is at the heart of many of these conflicts that we are trying to prevent or resolve. And when we've approached security sector assistance and engagement in the past, it has tended to be in a very technocratic way. We need these security actors to just be more capable, to have more equipment, more training, to be able to disrupt threats. And I think what the research is showing us, the research we're doing and that I know many of the partners are doing, is showing is that we also need to be thinking about how those security actors are perceived by local populations and how they are part of political processes that can be central to reducing violence. And so I think what the SAR has called for, and I think this bill also identifies, is the need for new and creative approaches to security force assistance, security sector assistance. Certainly in the CVE context, there's been a much greater focus on community-oriented policing and new models of thinking about this. So I'd put the question to the panel. In order to be successful in this shared endeavor, what is the role of security sector engagement and assistance, and how do we need to think about that?
Great. Why don't we take that to the panel now?
Sure, I can jump in. I think that's a great question, Peter. And as we think through, one of the fundamental challenges in these fragile environments with underperforming security sector, with low command and control, low capabilities in many places, and often an alignment with one or another of the identity groups. The question of who owns security is a fundamental challenge. We were meeting with the highest level military leadership of a strategic U.S. ally, talking about an insurgency that was going on in his country, and a campaign that they were planning to launch. And we said, he said, look, I'm a military man. I know if I ask my soldiers to stabilize this region, I know what that looks like. I know all the good and I know all the bad that comes with it. But at the end of the day, if I only have one button to push, that's the button I'm going to push. And so the question is, how do we build the rest? How do we build another button? How do we think through how security can operate in a different way and how security forces can operate in a different way? We've been working in Tilaberi in Niger, and on the other side of the Malian border, where the Green Berets were killed in Niger for many years. And one of the challenges that the Malian and Nigerian security forces face there is that they're being asked to step into different kinds of roles. The civilian government has fled, and so the military steps in. Local communities don't trust each other to report, and so the military intelligence steps in. And this overreach of the security is being drawn into things that neither soldiers want to be drawn into in a warfighting environment. It's the weakness in some ways of the civil society and how it reaches into the military, of the civilian administration, how that intersects with the military, that plays a critical role. And so not every case of insecurity can be fixed by security services alone. And there's a key role for every element. So yes, there's a need, and there's certainly a need for security. We work quite closely with security sector and how they reform. But as we take a holistic approach to stabilization, it's also what is the military doing, or what are the police doing that maybe they don't need to. Maybe that's not the most effective use of their time and their capacities.
Maybe we could turn to Pete and Pat just quickly to comment on that, because we've got both state and DoD-led efforts in this area, translating whole of government to a real alignment of U.S. assistance across agencies. Do you have thoughts to offer?
One thing I'd like to feature that the Secretary has really emphasized is our new Center for Analytics that's being by Undersecretary Bulatow, and also our Director, Jim Schwab. The analytics here, I think we can actually look at everything that everyone's doing. For instance, I would say, why are we not looking at every single dollar spent on CVE government-wide? Like, we need to be able to tag that money and code it and be able to look and visualize, where has that money actually been effective? Where has it been completely ineffective? And what were the types of programs that worked? We have the capabilities now to do that, but it's just a matter of activating them within the government, because we're behind the private sector in this regard. So we need to make sure to bring the private sector into it too.
Pat?
Sure. So, the fundamental objective of any government is to provide security. So you have to have security in order for stabilization to be long-lasting and effective. And then the tricky question, aptly put by Peter, is who do you work with and how do you do that? Within the Department of Defense, there's a number of programs that I think sometimes make it really difficult, because you have counterterrorism efforts happening within certain militaries. You have the conventional side of support that's happening as well. You have challenges with absorptive capacity within the countries where a lot of this aid is happening. You have to really focus, I think, on the critical programs we have in terms of education and training, which are probably more critical than a lot of the big ticket equipment kind of programs that are happening. What the department does really well is defense institution building, but where a lot of these countries that we're trying to stabilize, they don't have good institutions. They're really weak, and if at all, almost non-existent. So the countries we've picked right now for the stabilization annex is Central African Republic, Mali, Niger, Somalia, others in Africa. Those are showing us that how do you get this security apparatus within these countries going when they just don't have a lot of experience, expertise, education, skills to manage the security forces. So it's a big challenge. We've tried to do this in Iraq, Afghanistan, Somalia. I'm not sure to great effect. And then you have to ask the lingering question: is how will those countries in the end fund their security forces? That's something that is a really difficult challenge. So the approach, I think we have to be a little bit more creative on how to do this with a lot of buy-in dialogue with those on the ground.
Can I
Daphna?
sure,
Yeah.
sure. I offer a Mercy Corps perspective and then a USG perspective. And I would say the short answer, Peter, is that both sides need to kind of get beyond their traditional comfort zones. So there aren't that many development NGOs who are working on peace building from the bottom up, who feel comfortable and have the relationships to not only work with the local police for permits, for authorities, but to actually push them as an audience and as part of the theory of change. That takes a lot of time in the field, a lot of good relationships, a lot of trust to get at these issues of legitimacy. You know, I described the Kenyan work in some of the Nairobi slums where it took a long time for the Mercy Corps team to build the connections between the youth and the local police. And it's certainly not true across the 40 countries where we work, where we're able to actually work with the police. So have a security sector component to the peace building program. So solution number one is to have more development NGOs kind of get a little bit more out of their comfort zone to be comfortable and willing to work on security sector legitimacy. So from the USG side, you know, you're absolutely right. For too long, the professionalism of security sector assistance was a really very, very low floor and involved things like the Leahy Law and IMED and training that was not very accountable and really had to do with the sort of most egregious abuses. And then most importantly was punitive and after the fact and didn't prevent, right? So I do think there's been a very healthy movement across both DoD and state in the past 3 or 4 years towards understanding the need of sort of human rights training that's proactive, that's not just giving a PowerPoint about international humanitarian law to US mil partners, but to actually train on, in this type of operation, how would you ensure the protection of this community, right? So there's been movement on that. On the police issue, the kind of use of military forces for policing functions, that is an area where the INL Bureau at State needs to continuously look and work and figure out what are the interventions to help in that situation. And frankly, part of it is that our authorities in the US government, as you know, work with either police or the military units in these countries, where in many of these countries, there's fewer silos. There's much more crossover between domestic security forces and external security forces, and there's much more fluidity of the type of military forces that will work within communities. So I do think that at the level of Congress and US authorities and state DoD, there has to be a rethinking about the money and the interventions and the training that work in these fragile states from the bottom up.
There's one last point
sure.
I forgot to mention, but in Africa in particular, where a lot of these efforts on the stabilization annexes are happening, there are also UN peacekeeping or a variant of them, a political mission on the ground as well. And in their mandates, they have really strong, authority to really work security sector reform, DDR, and other things. So I think there's some potential synergy with other efforts ongoing on the ground, like was mentioned before, that we can also leverage.
Right. Well, we're going to have to wrap up now, but thank you to the 4 of you for a great exposition in a very compressed amount of time. Well done.
Again, in keeping with our tradition today, to save time, we're not doing glorious introductions of the many talented people that are here. And our task as your last panel is to try to drill down on some questions that may have evaded us in the earlier marvelous discussions we've had. And with our 5 diverse but complementary good experts to address what does the real peace building look like when we do interagency, intersector work, and how does that play out? We've asked for this panel each of our good participants to begin with a 2 to 3 minute overview of that question from their point of view. And then I have some pointed questions for them and hopefully some good Q&A again for the audience. So thank you very much. Our panelists, as you see them, of course, are Tim, Nancy, and Jake, Anselm. And we'll begin with Tim.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. It's really good to be here. I feel like I'm in a surreal world, stepping out of my daily routine. This panel, I think, is really important because it'll be building on ideas, theory, leadership, and if you weren't encouraged by the first panel with the senators here, then you need to come back for a rerun. I tell you what, I look at this panel as an opportunity to talk about.
May I just get the heck of the time?
Sorry, I'm too excited about stepping out of my real world. And, this panel is all about how do we actually get it done, the implementation of this very, very critical, vital component of what we're interested in doing. Let me put my USAID hat on for a minute. I'm privileged to do what Nancy used to do, lead the DACHA Bureau. That's Democracy, Conflict, and Humanitarian Assistance. We're up and running, spending most of our time in dealing with man-made conflicts, Yemen, the Sudans, Venezuela, Bangladesh, and Burma, and now DRC and the Ebola crisis. So in terms of the humanitarian assistance piece, we're up and running, and that is the result of our ineffectiveness in avoiding and preventing conflict. So that's the world that we exist in. And as we look at the future, it's hard and it's going to get tougher for a while. So that's why this forum and the leadership represented by the Congress this morning is so critical. I've spent 30 years in the military plus, and I've been privileged to be in the development world for the last 18 years. The development side is a lot harder. And it takes all the components that we have heard about this morning to pull it together. If there isn't leadership from Congress that gives us direction and laws and funding, and if it isn't brought together with an administration support and then the interagency support, then we might as well pursue other things. But all of the touch points that are necessary for a U.S. government and partner engagement are in place, and I'm really encouraged about that. Now, we heard, let me pull out some data points from my past experience, and I've set my talking points aside. $1.2 billion over 5 years, that's a drop in a bucket. When President Bush launched the malaria initiative on the heels of PEPFAR, it was $1.2 billion in 5 years, with a goal of reducing morbidity and mortality in 15 countries by 50%. And we were to go out and get other countries to match that. Our Congress put that in legislation. It authorized the lead agency in collaboration by the other agencies in order to pull off this rather modest program. The good news is the program bridged 3 administrations because of the congressional mandate and the funding. It mandated an interagency mechanism in order to pull off this notion of reducing morbidity and mortality by 50%, and it was accomplished. So it is possible with the leadership of the senators, with what you heard from Secretary Natali in terms of an interagency 3D approach to get this done. But the most challenging piece will not be funding. It will be the collaboration within the interagency to affect all that you have been hearing with the transition in government, with the transition in the interagency, holding true to the plan and the strategy will be a hard task. But I think what we've heard is based on the global challenges, it is an effort that we have to pursue. And within USAID, it is a priority by Administrator Green. We're very fortunate to have someone who understands this part of development, not to be confused with humanitarian assistance. Development in the context of prevention and fragility is a completely different discipline. And it takes planning, it takes interagency collaboration, not only with our government partners, but also with our nonprofit and our private sector. So let me just wrap it up here, and I'm really happy to be here and pleased all of you are engaged in this very, very important endeavor.
Thanks so much, Tim. Nancy.
Great. Thanks, George. Great to be here with George Lopez, who was at USIP at one point, but also thanks both to Scott and Maura. Father Ted Hesburgh is a huge hero for many of us, and he was really instrumental in the founding of U.S. Institute of Peace as well. So congrats on all this. This has been such a rich discussion. I feel like there should be a whole lot of ditto marks for everything that was said. In terms of what would success look like, I really think that the conversation with the two senators laid down a lot of key markers, and it would be in several big buckets. First of all, it would be how much money is allocated and where, with the more and more of it going into prevention buckets instead of kinetic action, humanitarian action, peacekeeping action. And so there would be changes in our congressional funding patterns. Secondly, building on what Tim just said, there would be, a decade hence, big changes in how we were organized interagency and how we moved forward with these kinds of assistance programs. So there would be big changes in our processes. Some of that is envisioned in the legislation in terms of how we want to unlock some of the bureaucratic strangleholds that currently prohibit or make it very, very difficult to do longer term iterative kinds of programming. The money, as probably everyone here knows, comes through these little soda straws that keep us from really doing what's critical on the ground. When I was in Tim's seat and we were dealing with the famine and the droughts in the Horn of Africa, we formed groups between our development and our humanitarian actors just within USAID to do joint planning in the field so that we were able to layer, sequence, and integrate different funding sources so that we were not doing programs based on the money that we had, but programs that addressed the problems in the field. Sounds like a really common sense solution. It's actually pretty radical because it involves a lot of extra work. You have to somersault through the requirements of each of those funding spigots. So if we are able to get rid of that, that's huge. Enable that greater problem solving approach instead of, everyone goes out with their own hammer. And then, we cannot underestimate the built-in incentives for there to be competition, not just between state aid and DoD, but even within each of those entities, there are multiple offices and bureaus that compete with each other. So if you say state's in the lead, well, which part of state? Aid's in the lead, which part of aid? And same question for DoD. So that's why I think what's really critical is success would be a shift to country-led processes, because we do a lot of what is commonly called the 8,000-mile screwdriver, where you create the programs here in Washington, but often when you get to the country, you lose a lot of the coloration of that competition, and the country teams that are smaller, that are closer to the context, the specificity of the challenge, they're able to collaborate in different ways. And so both the task force on extremism fragility that USIP conducted and the legislation call for country-led processes, which are country-led not just in terms of partnership with country, both government and civil society who are committed to reform, but also with our country teams and our donor partners, so that it really is designed, monitored, evaluated through that country lens. And then finally, what does it look like on the ground? I think it's really helpful to remember that there is an internationally negotiated vision of what a lot of this would look like embodied in the Sustainable Development Goals, but in particular in what I hope everyone in this room knows is Goal 16. We're getting into deep wonk here, but it's the goal that talks about increased access to justice, greater participation in the political process across marginalized group, greater social cohesion. It's all the things that we've heard all the panels talk about. And I think that is measurable, as Denise Natali talked about. And the big challenge is that it won't be measurable on any kind of political cycle. So we need to have the patience to harvest those outcomes over a decade.
Thank you, Nancy. Ann.
Thank you, George, and I'm extremely happy to be here. I think Dean Appleby talked about being pleased to be a small part of the conversation. I'm really pleased to be a small part of the small part of the conversation. I agree with Nancy. We need a lot of ditto marks to everything that's been said already this morning. We do not do, as a government, prevention very well. We're much better at crisis management than we are at crisis prevention because of the long-term and consistent and dedicated approach that is required to stick with a true crisis prevention strategy. Yet I would say the government does do crisis prevention all the time in its stovepipes, in the State Department, in USAID, and I would say even in the Defense Department, in building its mill engagements and providing security assistance. We just don't do it together strategically and pointed toward a single unified goal with a country strategy as well as we should. So I'm an optimist, and I think the foundation is there. I think the foundation is there to make the Stabilization Assistance Review work a success, to make the Global Fragility Act, once it's passed, a success, but it's going to take some sustained attention. I see looking at the elements of success going forward in 4 parts, and the most important in the hierarchy is leadership. We're going to need sustained leadership once the act is passed at all levels of the U.S. government. We've seen it from the congressional side, very importantly this morning. We've seen it from our previous panelists who've talked about the really important work that has been done already and is ongoing. And then we need it at the very highest levels of the government. We need this strategy, this new strategy that's going to come out of the Global Fragility Act and the work that's being done in stabilization to be nested in our broader national security strategy and to have the kind of priority that is going to be required in order to maintain sustained attention to it. Yes, we need the organizational structures to proceed effectively. I think we essentially have those in the U.S. government. We need guidance and guidance coming most recently, especially from the Defense Department, I have to say is extremely important. Pat Antonetti talked about the new directive that was issued last December. Little light beach reading for all of you, but there's a lot of goodness in it, and I turn you to it. But the broader point is that we're all state defense, USAID are large organizations, and we need that top line guidance. Takes a time to infuse in the top line guidance and then the derivative documents, the kind of direction that we're going to need to make this a sustained approach. So I would say patience, everyone. Partnerships, let's not forget the partnerships, the willingness of the host nation, working with our friends and allies, as Denise Natali talked about already, is just one of many examples in the Stabilization Leaders Forum, as well as with our friends and with civil society. And to those of you who are here from Congress, maintaining that oversight of the executive branch on a sustained basis is going to be enormously important. And then fourth, the funding. The recent task force that Nancy had a hand in talked a lot about breaking down stovepipes and aligning existing funding. And I think that's toward a prevention goal. That is extremely important. But as also was mentioned by, I think, Peter Quaranto, a lot of that funding comes with constraints. And so there are some challenges with legacy funding that need to be overcome. That's first. Secondly, that's why the additional funding that's being requested in the Global Fragility Act is so important, because time and again, we've seen in the counterterrorism space, in the CVE space, and in other related spaces that are relevant to moving forward in the strategic prevention area, that the funding is simply not flexible enough. And I think an important piece of this will be a partnership with Congress, so that we can it will authorize and appropriate flexible funding that can then be utilized in ways that are really effective. Last thing I'll just say, based on a lot of years in government, as a community, we're on the front end of improvements that we need to make in this area. And I do think important groundwork has been laid. But 20%, I would say about 20% of the work is designing the policy and agreeing the policy. And 80% of the work, at least, maybe 85, is getting it done. So we got a good start. We've got a long way to go.
And thank you. And what a great transition to Jake, getting it done and Ansel.
That's a fantastic
Jake, let's start with you.
Thank you so much for hosting this today. It's really been humbling to hear all the different perspectives and certainly be a part of this panel. Directly to your point, I think in order for this bill to have real teeth and for it to make the impact that all of us want it to have on the ground, I think we're going to have to really start having some really bold new ideas. I think we're going to have to innovate at all levels. What we've been doing, and this was said earlier, what we've been doing historically is not working, and we've got to get some new ideas out there. And so I'd like to offer just maybe 4 points of innovation I think that could be helpful in putting together a winning solution. The first one actually speaks to Peter's earlier question about security. We have got to find new ways for DoD to innovate with the NGO community. My time as a Marine in combat, my former job, my guys and I saw that at a grassroots, on the ground level, we are losing the fight for hearts and minds of these highly vulnerable communities that matter most at ground zero in the war against extremism. And that is really because these communities are in these places, like they're the ones that are being influenced and pressured by these violent extremist groups. And by nature, they're in close proximity with these groups. And these locations are many times far too dangerous for actors to actually be able to reach. So we've got to find a new way to be able to get implementing partners in these communities doing sustainable development, not humanitarian assistance, as we discussed, sustainable development. That's going to require DoD to put some new thinking into how they work with the NGO community. Now, what this does not mean is provisional reconstruction teams or village stabilization operations that DoD has done in the past. But there has been some new thinking already out there. And actually, Pat mentioned this before. The Defense Support Stabilization Operations is one of the new initiatives that has been, they tried to get through the NDAA last year. USAID has done some great thinking for over the last year in these rapid expeditionary deployment teams is a new concept that they were looking at as well. So there has been some great ground laid, but we've got to get past that with even more innovation about how DoD works in these spaces. Because at the end of the day, implementing partners have to be in these communities to build trust, and that's going to require a whole new level of security and expertise. Second point is we need new measurement tools. We've heard a lot about measurement today. We've got to be able to define success and measure against that success. And that's also going to require some new thinking. As we all know, the hard part about preventing conflict and violent extremism and measuring that is, how do you measure a non-event? You know, what's the counterfactual? Mm-hmm. But I think there's a lot of great work that's already been done, groundbreaking work by groups like Mercy Corps and some of their partners in this space. But I think there's room for new thinking. You know, I think we've got to get outside our box of this is not just an NGO or a government issue. Preventing conflict and violent extremism is a global challenge that requires the very best thinkers across all sectors, not just government and in the NGO community. We should be going to MIT and talking to JPAL. We should go to Silicon Valley and go to data analytics teams from the top tech firms and pull them into this conversation to create tools that can better inform our implementation on the ground. Third, I think we need new funding mechanisms. We have got to find ways to get capital from groups like USAID directly to the implementers on the ground doing the work. And these implementers are not the big contractors. These are the smaller organizations that are agile. They can make data-driven decisions to change real time as the situation changes on the ground. Now, my hat's off to USAID because they've actually done some great work in this already through something called a new mechanism called the New Partnerships Initiative. It's a new mechanism that will get capital directly out to what they call underutilized partners, organizations that have spent less than $25 million in USAID funding over the last 5 years. But we need to push the envelope on some new ways to get this funding into the field. And finally, I'd say, to make all of this happen and to make this thing really work, we've got to really push the envelope on what we think about culture. We've got to introduce a whole new level of risk tolerance in the culture of all the agencies and civil society. We have to be willing to fail. We can't be afraid of failure. If we're going to win, you got to be willing to fail. And what that means is we need to put new incentives in place that allow program managers to try new ideas, that allow them to fail occasionally. We need a design mentality and a fail fast, learn fast mentality that will change the culture of how we do our work. But to do that, it really requires a big shift in mindset.
We didn't rehearse this, but the segues from one to the other couldn't be more wonderful. Ansel.
Yeah.
And our first audio visual aid begins to appear. There you go.
Okay.
There you go.
So I'll be going through this. I will take the perspective of a normal farmer in the DRC. So I took this picture late in November last year in Kichanga, where one of our projects is implemented with Mercy Corps around food security. So I was there to conduct some focus group discussion in order to build content for a one-shot film that will be used to kind of trigger dialogue at a community level addressing the food security issue. So for the purpose of storytelling, let me call him John. So John's family used to work for Belgian big farmers who could provide them with space to build their house, a space to grow enough food for their family needs, and of course a salary. Now Belgians are gone, and most of those lands are now owned by other people. And those people evacuated John's family. Now John's family has grown big, but the family land didn't not grow. So they have to kind of share the same space, and the places they have to grow food is now very small. So he has a land access issue. What does he do to overcome this? He will try to rent for a place to grow his food. And in the context of Kichanga, there is a security issues that makes lands that are close to the village become very expensive for rent. So he cannot go far because all places that are remote are full with armed group and other gangs. So he will take the minimum of lands to grow his food. And when he manages, and this will lead to the third challenge John is facing. So he's not well trained to produce enough on a reduced space. And he will come up with a very small sack, maybe of cassava and maize, like the one you see on the picture. But on the way from the farm to the marketplace, he will have to give some of that harvest to armed group in order to pass. And along the way, he will meet many checkpoints from the army and will need to pay. And maybe if he doesn't have money, he will give again some of the food he's taking to the marketplace. And when he gets to the marketplace, there comes the problem of taxes. He will need to pay many taxes, and most of those taxes do not have receipts. So it's like taxes that are decided by people in the market. And when he's done with all that, at the end, when he has to sell his product, he's not the one who is fixing the price. So the buyer will decide the price for John. And at the end, for something like the package he has on that bicycle will give him hardly a net benefit of $15. So when John goes back home with that benefits, it's not enough to cover basic needs. He has kids who need to pay school. He must cover health care. But John has teenager sons who will not be happy with that situation and maybe will join armed group. And this happens very often. And joining the armed groups in that context, many armed groups have a kind of ethnic or tribal connotation. So people will not see John's son as someone who joined armed group just to try to get a way to survive, but they will link him with his tribe. And this will be branded like ethnic conflicts. So all the conflict that are going on in that area take roots in, I would say, an early past with the colonialism, but also with all the armed all war that's have been taking place in the East, starting by the Rwandan genocides that made many people, many Hutus flee from Rwanda to DRC. And then there is Kabila in 1996. So all that's created kind of dividing line between the population. So what do we do to help Mr. John? So you see how all the challenges John is going through are like multi-layered. And you cannot address the land issue without taking into account the security issue, or the best farming practices issue, or the tax regulation issue, and the market regulation, and that dimension of identities that are being manipulated by people who are taking benefit from that kind of situation. So in this context, we are working with Mercy Corps, and we are trying to engage as much as actor as we can. So we work with state institutions like the Ministry of Agriculture to address the land issue, but also all that is linked to agriculture. We are working closely with the army and the police to address all the security issues. And Mercy Corps is holding the big part of what is intended to better the situation of small farmers. But all that cannot be achieved successfully if we are not addressing all that peace building aspects in that context. So I think that in the future, when developing kind of strategies to address vulnerability or fragility, we have to think John. We have to think the small farmer. We have to think the ordinary people on the ground. So how will we impact them? So this will be, according to me, a good start to build something that will be really effective and bring positive results. So
thank you for
Thank
bringing
you.
us to that point, because yes, please. With such good statements from each of you and noting the time and a large but patient audience, I think we'd like to start Q&A from the audience. So again, like three rounds of three, if we can get them in. We have our mobile mics. Who would like to start a question? Identify yourself if you have it for a particular panelist, then mention that. The floor is open. We have one person way in the back there near the mic. Do we have a second or a third before you begin? Okay, please start.
Okay, my name is Mary. I'm a student at the University of Notre Dame, and I'm also from Kenya. My question is to the panelists, and I think this is a very timely bill and act right now, But the question is there a place for community-based kind of metrics when it comes to determining what change looks like? And if there is, what are the organizations that are at the grassroots doing to ensure that the donors relate to that? Because sometimes it's easy to look at the change from the perspective of the donor, but what about the community that we are working with? And how do we hope to see that change is as they envision too, not just for the interest of the donors? Thank you.
Thank you. Since there's no other hand, Anselm and Jake, I want to know if you might take that. One more, thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for sharing your insights. My name is Lois, and I'm a student. Well, I graduated recently from the Keough School. So my question is a general question that anyone from the panel can answer. So I wanted to ask how you can deal with power differentials when you're implementing an interagency approach, especially if you're working with different communities or different countries. Thank you.
And we have a third not far from Lois.
Thank you. I'm Victoria Nyanjira, a student from Kroc and currently interning with Generations for Peace. Looking at the aspect of coordination, I know most development partners go on ground and have different mandates. So sometimes as these programs are being designed, you find there's an issue on ground, but there's no one who is trying to look at that. For example, like I come from Uganda. During the conflict in northern Uganda, priorities really looked at trying to resettle those who were returning from captivity, communities that were internally displaced camps, but we don't focus much on the long-term aspect of how best some of these communities should be, how best the program should be designed in a way that helps to prevent violence that is to come in future. So my question, or just like an issue up, is how can this start from here? As you design programs to intervene in a community, how long should such a program look like? And do we try to capture in all the different aspects that is likely to come in the process? Thank you.
Thank you. Three challenging questions in their own way, focusing on the local to big program link.
Yes, I would say, how would change look like? So I will go on with the same example I've started with. So I think we all have all those indicators we have in our projects when we submit them to funders. But at the end, the change has to be pictured at the community level. So, and for this program we are through with Mercy Corps, it's all about building resilience within the communities. So I can say there is a change when I see, for example, the normal farmer like John has developed other alternatives to be more resilient in that kind of circumstance and take the step to kind of change the system. It will take time. It's not something that will happen like for a year or two. So it's a whole process, and we at Search for Common Ground, we believe that peace is a process. So all we need to do is to take the first step and keep working. But we also believe that with that integrated approach, we can be much more alert on what kind of change we really need to produce at the community level. So the main indicator is the community.
So, thank you. Jake, you want to take?
Just a couple quick thoughts. Excellent questions, by the way. I think the problem, I'll speak first to the design question. So I think I feel passionately, as do some of our partners, about the concept of co-design, co-creation of programming. For outsiders, for Westerners to assume they're going to solve problems, go in and tell people what's best for them is highly arrogant, condescending, and ignorant. It must be driven by locally led development. So I think restoration of agency in a lot of the communities that our implementing partners are working in must be a critical component of the solution. You've got to give the people in these communities a real seat at the table with real buy-in and ownership of the solutions. The second thing I'd like to mention is about the power dynamic that was mentioned in one of the questions. There is a definite power dynamic that's at play between the donor community, whether that's through government or private donors, and the implementers on the ground. In my limited experience, I've seen a disturbing trend of development solutions being driven by the donor community and not the implementers as much on the ground. Metrics are actually designed around the donors themselves and less around what are the actual programmatic outcomes that we want to see from the community on the ground, having those conversations, building those logic models, and drive that data back up to the donors. I would love to see solutions coming from implementing partners and the donor community being more of the kind of agency that tries to find the real bright spots that are out there that are working, and then provide flexible funding to really scale up those initiatives to drive greater impact.
Thank you. Who else wants to jump in on this?
Just make a couple of comments. I think the John example puts exactly the bullseye on the target here. From our opening comments, if it is all about the individual, and what Anselmi just did is he flipped the paradigm from things invented in Washington and New York to what's important to John. And that's exactly the issue we're dealing with today in the DRC Ebola outbreak. It isn't the virus that's causing us the problem. We have succeeded in containing the virus 9 previous times in DRC. This 10th outbreak is different because of insecurity, because of fragility. Okay, so we have 3 vectors that are compounding the situation in North Kivu and Ituri provinces. It's security, lack thereof. If you ask WHO and many of the partners, they say we need more security. If you ask some of the NGOs, they are saying we need less security. So there's a counterintuitive challenge there on how to deal with the ability to take on the virus, but more importantly, how do we understand the community and get the community to collaborate, not resist, but to be the beneficiary of this great health endeavor that is not doing so well. So this is an example that is ongoing today that represents a cross-section of security. How do we do it differently? How do we approach the community needs differently so that we can lick and contain the virus, which is in our national security interest to contain it at its source? So it is a compound problem. And if you were listening here in the last few minutes, it all boils down to a development challenge, a 10-year plus very sophisticated development opportunity and challenge, and less of a critical, how do we respond to stabilization, which is development at its best, and how do we avoid fragility, and that is a compound factor problem that we have been discussing. So it is long term. It takes patience. It takes collaboration, starting at the ground, understanding what the people there, like Jake and his team, and Anselmi is telling us, to actually, like I said before, flip the paradigm upside down and start there rather than here.
Nancy or Ann, do you want to jump in?
Keying off the Ebola challenge, when we were battling the West African Ebola crisis, early on, like July, August of that year, Ann and I were both doing a lot of work on that. One of the big challenges is that there was no shared understanding of what the best approach was. Was it a medical problem? Was it a logistical problem? Was it a behavior change problem? And so I want to just remind us that one of the core recommendations in the Fragility Act and in the task force recommendations is that we get a shared understanding of what the problem is. And I think the John example is wonderful because it outlines the fact that it's complex. You really need to understand all the components, and that gets at the questions that were asked, because it is both short-term and long-term. It is all of the dimensions that John faces, and it requires the ability of people coming together to understand that, but with local leadership. And so I think I love the title of this, and it builds off of what Ann said. We have unbelievable decades-long momentum. And this 20% has taken about a decade in terms of leadership and scholarship and thinking. And I look around this room and I see a lot of people, we've been having this conversation for a long time. And a lot of people have a lot of tracks on their back from having tried to, push this through. We are at a wonderful moment right now, but we are at the hardest part because we have, decades and decades of bureaucratic practices and structures that will not yield easily to the prescription that we've all identified that we need. And so to understand both the short-term and the long-term needs of that Ugandan community and the security and the agricultural and the health and the governance challenges requires us all thinking differently. So these are all important questions, but it is a profound change that we are tiptoeing into right now that will take a lot of effort going forward.
Absolutely. And I want to key off of what Nancy said and something that Jake said earlier, which is profoundly important. Once we arrive at, we build a common understanding and the derivative common and shared understandings of where we need to go based on a ground up approach. We need to build into our system a greater tolerance for risk. We need to share that risk. And using the Ebola response example, when there appear to be missteps or a lack of agility or an inefficiency in particularly a U.S. government response or U.S. government response with our partners or with the host nation, it pops up on the net really fast. And so I think we're going to have to consider how we work together to allow for failure so that we can increasingly allow for success. On the power dynamic question, there are several, I'm not sure exactly what underlay all of the question, but I just want to mention one thing that goes back to something that Nancy said earlier about how we need to shift the way that we are making decisions, the way that the community, the national security community looks at problem sets. So we're moving down the spectrum from conflict, from response and crisis management to conflict prevention. We do have, in the context of counterterrorism, primarily a defense-led strategy, but we don't have a defense-decided strategy. This is a U.S. government. This is based on U.S. government policies that are developed with the State Department, with other members of the national security community, and ultimately imprinted by the White House. And so, so the Defense Department per se is going to be a partner in this continuing effort. Already, I think, well positioned to take the first step. I just want to read one thing, which I meant to do in my opening remarks, and it's from this really cool document that was issued last December. It says, stabilization requires an integrated and international unity of purpose with common objectives. That's in a defense directive. So, so again, we are in a defense-led, more or less strategy, but we are not in a purely defense-decided strategy. I want to leave everybody with a sense of opportunity for making the shift.
Thank you. Before I go to other questions, a prerogative of the chair to tie together some things, because we do have a number of think tank people, academic analysts, and others here. The shift that this requires, that has, as Nancy said, been in the works for a while, but now we need to make explicit. Number one, we are no longer in an orthogonal world. We're no longer in a two-plane world. We're in a multi-dimensional world, which requires systems analysis, no longer A causes B, no longer regression equations for determining what's the single strongest factor and then the next factor. That dynamic of thinking puts us more in the realm of engineering, analytics, and various other kinds of things. Secondly, it's been raised a couple of times, not only what indicators and monitoring of indicators, but which ones matter to which communities. And how do we have community buy-in with the most significant indicators at which point in time? And then thirdly, again, to underscore, every program review using the indicators and the systems analysis is going to produce mixed results, as opposed to this is accomplishing this, which again argues for the long term, argues for the risk taking, argues for the cultural narrowness of some of the ways we have to formulate even the methodology. And that is light years away from where we were about a decade ago in the thinking community, trying to be helpful to the active community and the policy community. A new set of questions. Way in the back there.
Yes, hello. My name's Larry Wohlers, was with the State Department, but continue to work on good governance in the security sector in West and Central Africa. I want to thank you for an interesting discussion. I want to just raise one issue I don't think is perhaps being given quite enough attention. When I see senior people in these countries, I see people who understand they need better governance and are passionate about it. But they are also in institutions that are being sapped and distorted by money. And sometimes, as in Congo, it's huge amounts of money and very sophisticated. Other times, as in Central African Republic, it's small amounts of money and more artisanal. But in all cases, the money isn't staying at home. It's going across borders and being enabled by the international financial system. So we're all a part of the problem. How do we deal with this? And I understand it's really hard. A, it's so murky. B, because most of us who do conflict don't understand finance. But I do believe until we get a handle on it, we're not going to be able to get the local institutions to be working in hand to address the needs of local populations and take over management of these issues.
Thank you. We have
lots of hands.
second question here. Then where are we here? And a third. Oh, you already have a microphone.
No, I had.
Okay. Okay. So second there and then third. Right here. Microphone to this gentleman. Put your hand back up. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is John Paul Adrian. I'm an active duty officer with the U.S. Air Force, currently in an exchange program with the Department of State, and very happy to be here also as a Notre Dame graduate. So my question for the panel at large is, we've identified several issues where stovepiping has not worked well for us, and in fact has really caused quite a few issues across our efforts looking towards stabilization and addressing fragility. What are current efforts now in breaking down these stovepipes, both interagency stovepipes and then also with our NGO partners that are out there? And then are those successful, or are those reading success? And what do we need to do next?
Okay, a last question here that might be helpful. Peter.
First, I just want to echo what Ambassador Wohler said and commend to this community. I think one of the best pieces of work that has come out of the research community in the past year is the book that Rachel Kleinfeld wrote, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with The Savage Order, and it puts a real emphasis on the way in which the international financial systems are part of these challenges and need to be addressed. I think this panel has done a really important job of highlighting that the momentum in the donor community will not be successful if it's not connected to local perspectives, partnerships, etc. There's another critical actor in all of this, and that is the role of national governments. And I think we all know that in many of the places that come to mind when we talk about fragility and conflict, the national governments are at best incapable of addressing these challenges, but at worst, and often the case, are actually contributing to and benefiting from some of the things that drive fragility and conflict. I think Nancy, the task force, put a real spotlight on the need for new ways of partnering with national governments. And so I put the question to the panelists, as we think about all the momentum that's needed, all the partnerships, what is the role of national governments, and how can the engagement that's been being driven out of Washington also change the way that national governments think about these problems?
A hefty set of questions, panel.
Let me just jump on a couple things and then we'll have the panel clean up. But the stovepiping issue is real. It's usually linked to cash. I think the fact that the Congress is behind the act and that we have had strong collaboration in the interagency to come up with a mechanism that Secretary Natali addressed, where state is in the lead in terms of shaping policy, and then DOD and USAID are the principal implementing components of it, is key. Then it becomes a function of leadership, forcing objectives. And again, Secretary Natali was very clear. This is not development globally that we're striving to do. We're striving to achieve stability and reduce fragility in specific places that are in our national interest that complement other priorities. So there is a pecking order in terms of the agenda of where we apply the focus, the metrics, and the funding. And that is also an interagency effort that needs to be driven by clear, crisp congressional direction and administration and State Department and our cabinet. So we're not out of the woods on that. We can talk about it all day. It's a recurring challenge that exists within the family of the U.S. government. And so that just is top dead center on anything that is of this nature and has this type of absolute requirement to bring everybody together. Let me just stop there.
Okay, thank you. Let's go right down the line.
So a couple of points that pull those three questions together. The first is to your point, Peter, we need to think of these, we have a global system, we have state systems, we have community and local systems, and we really need to be thinking how each of those systems work and then how they interrelate. And you can absolutely solve community problems, but if you don't connect it up to national level processes, you will not have a sustained solution. And so the problem is different contexts will enable you to have more impact here at the top or here at the bottom. And the real challenge is, what do you do in those places that have utterly recalcitrant national governments? And what the task force looked at is, can you partner subnationally? Can you try to find, proof points within a national system? But it is being able to do that analysis. And I think, as everyone has emphasized, you absolutely need top down and bottom up. You need to work to create constituents for peace and stability and to solve those issues, and then connect that up to more less fragile governments. And it's going to look differently everywhere. And it's nested within regional and international systems that need to be a part of the political and security. What Larry brought up, and I would add the whole international arms trade. I mean, there are a number of international dynamics and processes that have considerable impact and influence on what goes on in different, cross-border issues, transboundary smuggling, etc. So it's utterly complex. We live in an utterly complex world. So thank you for your summation, George, on the engineering complexity theory, because we are all going to have to get out of, I think, what Daphne called get out of our comfort zone. And NGOs need to understand the political nature of our work, fundamentally political, even if you're just delivering humanitarian assistance, and at least be more aware of that. And, government and security, everybody needs to take a broader lens. And it will be more complicated and complex, but it is ultimately rooted locally with engaging local actors at both the government and.
Thanks, Nancy.
I'd just like to emphasize the last point that Nancy made and Daphne made. We all need to get a little bit out of our comfort zones in our respective agencies, cultures, within the NGO community. We need
get over ourselves a little bit. And I think that will help. It will help open a path to working together more effectively, at least to learn from one another when there are areas in which we're not necessarily going to be collaborating directly. And I would invite especially the NGO community to think creatively about what more can be done in this area to collaborate with the U.S. government across all levels.
Speaking of the NGO community,
one thought, actually, again, Peter, to your comments about national governments, almost as a cautionary note, I think for us as a team on this Global Fragility Act, I think there's a real danger that we focus entirely on country plans and we begin to ignore larger regional effects. I mean, these challenges that we're addressing in fragility are all regional. These violent extremist groups, ISIS, Al Qaeda, and all their variants, they don't respect borders, right? These problems are transnational, and I think a heavy focus on regional strategies, I think, would help all of us to again see better success from this act. And then the other thought I had was around the financing question, the corrupting effect of money in the system. It's not just an international or national level problem. I think we need to address that problem all the way down to the local level. And I think there's an opportunity here to engage the private sector, both financial institutions for new financial instrument design, but also technology companies. You know, let's get with the telecom companies who are creating new platforms for mobile money. I know a lot of us on the ground that are doing implementation are using mobile money now to weed out corruption in our distribution system, so there's no cash transfers that are happening at the local level. There's lots of great innovation done in this space. So I think it's a great question, but I think it's not just corruption at the international, national level, it's all the way down to that level.
Thank you. Benson.
So I think I will likely repeat what is just said. I've been with some senators on the same issue, and for me, there is maybe another way to make sure that the money we put in a country really serves the purpose. So one of the ways was just like to engage with private sectors, and I gave the example that is again related to John's challenge. Sometimes only making a road that links a village to the city may have an impact on all the population living in the area. But when there is a funding coming in country, so the interest of the donor may not be the interest of the government that receives the money. And when the government releases the money for the structure that has to implement the project, maybe they have other interests. So we at Search for Common Ground, we try to make a difference between the position, what you state, and the interest, what does really matter. So, and I think trying to emphasize what you said.
Nancy.
So on all those layers, we have to make sure people have the same interest. So at the community level, local association, civil society, the government, and the donors agree on where are we heading to. So this is very, very important. You will not be engaging with angels in all this structure. Now, there will not be all angels. So you have to be aware that you may fail, as you said. So you have to take that risk, but develop some mechanism to try to mitigate all those risks. And keep in mind that all we are doing is to serve the community level. So
I think that that's a great way for us to end. You don't put St. Francis, Gandhi around the table to make peace. You put scoundrels, liars, cheats, and murderers. That's the terrible world in which we live. We learned that at USIP and other places. I'm going to invite Dean Appleby to offer us some concluding comments.
Well, first, let's thank this terrific panel.
We've had a rich panel, rich conversation here and throughout the morning. If we think for a moment about all the bases we've touched, in a sense, we first of all have approached these problems from various angles, from the question of violent extremism to stabilization, conflict prevention, development. And throughout these conversations, it's been clear that we have to break out of our silos and integrate and collaborate. Similarly, we've heard from various perspectives, from Congress, from federal agencies, from development organizations, from think tanks, from the academy, and all of these voices are necessary. These problems are so enormous that we have to all pitch in, because implementation, measuring, evaluation, how do we account for success and measure it and improve and fail better and better so that we succeed better every time? This is going to require all hands on deck. I'm happy to say that the Keough School is committed to continuing to be part of this conversation. Our students and graduates are here, and I'm so happy that they asked such good questions, because we'll be turning things over to them before we know it. And we will stay committed at Notre Dame to this conversation. And I want to thank all of you for being part of it, for our panelists, our rich discussions, our moderators, and we hope we'll continue the conversation very shortly in the months and years ahead. Thank you very much.